The Last Trail. Martha Phillips adjusted her weathered hiking boots one final time as she stood at the trailhead of the Highline Trail in Glacier National Park. The morning sun of July 6, 2024, casting long shadows across the parking area. At 71 years old, she possessed the kind of lean, wiry frame that spoke of decades spent traversing mountain paths. Her silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail beneath a faded blue baseball cap that had seen countless adventures. The deep lines etched around her pale blue eyes told stories of wind and weather, of sunrises witnessed from remote peaks and storms weathered in thin mountain air. Martha had been hiking these trails for over 40 years, ever since her late husband Robert had first brought her to Glacier during their honeymoon in 1976. Back then, she had been a nervous 23-year-old from suburban Minneapolis, more comfortable navigating shopping malls than mountain switchbacks. But Robert, a geology professor with an infectious passion for the wilderness, had gradually transformed her apprehension into genuine love for the backcountry. He had taught her to read topographical maps, to identify animal tracks in muddy trail sections, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated changing weather patterns in the mountains. After Robert's death from cancer 3 years earlier, these annual solo trips to Glacier had become Martha's way of maintaining their shared connection to the wild places they had explored together. She would spend hours sitting beside alpine lakes, talking quietly to his memory, sharing observations about wildlife sightings or particularly stunning vistas. Her grown children, David and Sarah, worried constantly about their mother venturing alone into bear country at her age, but Martha insisted that the mountains were where she felt most alive, most connected to Robert's spirit. This particular morning carried special significance for Martha. It marked exactly 48 years since she and Robert had first hiked the Highline Trail together, a young couple full of dreams and plans for the future. She had brought along their original 1976 trail map, now yellow with age and soft from countless foldings, tucked carefully in her daypack, alongside modern GPS equipment and emergency supplies. The ritual had become sacred to her, retracing their footsteps on this anniversary date whenever possible. The parking area at Logan Pass buzzed with early morning activity as day hikers prepared for various adventures throughout the park. Martha recognized several familiar faces from previous years, nodding politely to fellow regular visitors while maintaining the quiet solitude she preferred. She had learned over the decades that many younger hikers viewed her with a mixture of admiration and concern, impressed by her obvious experience, but worried about her age and solo status in dangerous terrain. Among the other hikers preparing for their day was the Johnson family from Denver. Michael Johnson, a 45-year-old emergency room physician, his wife Lisa, a 38-year-old high school biology teacher, and their 3 children ranging from 8 to 16 years old. They had planned this vacation for months, saving money and coordinating schedules to bring the entire family to Glacier for their first major backpacking expedition together. Michael had extensive wilderness medical training and always carried a comprehensive first aid kit, having volunteered with mountain rescue organizations in Colorado for over a decade. Also present were college students Kevin Martinez and Ashley Chen, both 22 years old and recent graduates from the University of Montana's Wildlife Biology program. They were conducting unofficial research on wildlife behavior patterns for potential graduate school applications, carrying cameras with telephoto lenses and detailed observation notebooks. Kevin, whose Mexican-American family had immigrated to Montana when he was 12, had grown up exploring the wilderness areas around Missoula and possessed an almost intuitive understanding of animal behavior. Ashley, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who owned a successful restaurant in Billings, had initially pursued wildlife biology against her parents' wishes, but had proven to be exceptionally talented at tracking and field observation. The weather forecast for July 6th called for partly cloudy skies, with temperatures reaching the mid-70s at higher elevations, ideal conditions for hiking. The seasonal snowpack had melted earlier than usual that summer, due to higher-than-average temperatures throughout June, leaving the high country accessible weeks ahead of the typical schedule. This early melt had concentrated wildlife activity along lower elevation corridors, where water and vegetation remained abundant, creating unusual animal movement patterns that would prove significant in the hours to come. Park rangers had posted standard bear safety information at all trailheads, noting increased grizzly activity throughout the region as bears emerged from their dens and began foraging for early summer food sources. The previous week had seen several bear sightings along popular trails, though no aggressive encounters had been reported. Rangers emphasized the importance of hiking in groups, making noise to avoid surprising bears, and carrying bear spray as essential safety equipment. Martha checked her gear methodically, a ritual she had refined over decades of solo hiking. Her day pack contained 2 cans of bear spray, one clipped to her belt and another secured inside the main compartment. She carried a whistle, emergency shelter, first aid supplies, water purification tablets, high-energy food, rain gear, and warm layers despite the pleasant morning temperature. Her cell phone, though likely to have limited service on the trail, was fully charged and equipped with offline GPS maps. She had left detailed itinerary information with the front desk of her hotel in West Glacier, specifying her planned route and expected return time. At exactly 7:15 in the morning, Martha began her hike along the Highline Trail, following the well-maintained path that contoured along the Continental Divide. The trail initially climbed gradually through subalpine meadows dotted with early wildflowers, offering spectacular views across the Flathead Valley to the west. Martha moved at her characteristic steady pace, developed over years of mountain hiking, her breathing controlled and efficient despite the gradually increasing altitude. The Highline Trail represented one of Glacier National Park's most popular day hikes, stretching approximately 11 miles from Logan Pass to the Granite Park Chalet area. The path followed an ancient route used by Native American hunting parties for centuries before European settlement, later adapted by park service crews into a maintained hiking trail. The route traversed through multiple ecosystems, from alpine meadows to dense coniferous forests, providing habitat for a diverse array of wildlife, including mountain goats, bighorn sheep, marmots, and both black and grizzly bears. Approximately 2 miles from the trailhead, Martha paused at a familiar rock outcropping where she and Robert had always stopped to rest and admire the view. She pulled out his photograph, a candid shot taken during their first hike together, showing him grinning broadly while pointing toward a distant mountain peak. The edges of the photograph had become worn from handling, but his expression of pure joy remained vivid. Martha spoke quietly to the image, updating him on family news and sharing her observations about changes in the landscape over the years. Unknown to Martha, approximately 800 yards ahead on the trail, a large male grizzly bear had been foraging in a dense patch of huckleberry bushes since before dawn. The bear, later estimated by wildlife biologists to weigh approximately 650 pounds, was in his prime at 8 years old, possessing the massive build and aggressive temperament characteristic of dominant male grizzlies during peak foraging season. His dark brown fur showed the distinctive silver-tipped guard hairs that gave grizzlies their name, while his prominent shoulder hump indicated the powerful muscle structure that enabled these bears to dig through frozen ground and overturn massive logs in search of food. This particular bear had established a large territory covering several hundred square miles throughout the northern sections of Glacier National Park and adjacent wilderness areas. Wildlife researchers had documented his presence through trail camera photographs and scat analysis for several years, noting his unusual size and apparent lack of fear regarding human presence. Unlike many grizzlies that actively avoided areas with regular human activity, this bear seemed indifferent to hikers and had been observed multiple times, foraging within sight of popular trails. The bear's behavioral patterns had been influenced by a childhood encounter with human food sources when garbage management practices in the park were less stringent than current standards. As a young cub, he had learned to associate certain human scents with potential food rewards, creating a dangerous conditioning that persisted into adulthood. While never overtly aggressive toward humans, he displayed none of the natural wariness that typically kept grizzlies away from areas with regular human traffic. Recent drought conditions throughout the region had concentrated the bear's foraging activities along the Highline Trail corridor, where seasonal water sources and diverse vegetation provided abundant food opportunities. The early snowmelt had triggered an extended growing season for many plant species that formed crucial components of the grizzly diet, including various berries, roots, and tender shoots. This abundance had attracted the bear to spend increasing amounts of time in areas that would normally see only occasional grizzly presence. As Martha continued along the trail, she followed her standard practice of making periodic noise to alert any wildlife to her presence. She would call out, "Hey, bear!" every few minutes, clap her hands loudly when approaching blind corners or dense vegetation, and maintain awareness of wind direction that might affect how far her voice carried. These precautions had served her well throughout decades of solo hiking in bear country, though she recognized that no safety measures could guarantee complete protection in wilderness environments. The trail surface at this elevation consisted of well-packed earth with occasional rocky sections, bordered by dense vegetation that could easily conceal large animals until hikers were quite close. Alpine fir and subalpine larch created a broken canopy overhead, allowing filtered sunlight to reach the forest floor, where various shrubs and wildflowers flourished in the brief mountain growing season. The terrain offered numerous hiding spots where bears might rest or forage without being visible from the trail until someone passed within close proximity. Martha's pace remained steady as she climbed gradually through a series of gentle switchbacks designed to ease the grade over more challenging terrain. Her breathing showed no signs of distress, despite the increasing elevation, testimony to her excellent cardiovascular condition maintained through regular hiking and daily walks around her Minneapolis neighborhood. She paused occasionally to photograph particularly striking wildflower displays or mountain vistas, but kept her stops brief to maintain her planned schedule for reaching the Granite Park Chalet area and returning to Logan Pass before late afternoon. At approximately 8:30 in the morning, Martha encountered the Johnson family, who had started their hike about 20 minutes behind her. The family was moving more slowly due to the varying paces of their 3 children, with frequent stops for water breaks and photography. Michael Johnson recognized Martha from previous years and called out a friendly greeting, asking about trail conditions ahead and sharing information about wildlife sightings from other hikers they had met. "Beautiful morning for hiking," Michael commented as the families passed on a wider section of trail. "Have you seen any bears yet this year?" Martha smiled and shook her head. "Not yet today, but I saw fresh scat about a mile back. Big tracks too. Grizzly, I think. Just keep making noise and you should be fine." Lisa Johnson looked concerned at this information, glancing at her children who were busy examining interesting rocks along the trail edge. "How fresh did the scat look?" she asked. "Pretty fresh," Martha replied honestly. "Maybe from last night or early this morning, but that's normal for this area. I've been hiking these trails for 40 years and only seen a handful of bears, usually from a good distance. They generally want to avoid us as much as we want to avoid them." The Johnson family continued their hike with heightened awareness after Martha's warning. Michael ensuring that his children understood the importance of staying close together and making regular noise. Their youngest child, 8-year-old Emma, began calling out, "Hey, bear!" every few steps with the enthusiasm typical of children who had been given an important job to do. Meanwhile, approximately half a mile ahead, Kevin Martinez and Ashley Chen had stopped to observe a small herd of mountain goats grazing on a steep slope above the trail. Ashley was photographing the animals with her telephoto lens, while Kevin recorded behavioral observations in his field notebook, noting the animals' feeding patterns and apparent comfort level despite their proximity to the hiking trail. "The goats seem really relaxed today," Kevin commented, watching through binoculars as several young kids playfully chased each other across the rocky terrain. "Usually, they're much more skittish around the trail corridor." Ashley lowered her camera and frowned slightly. "That's actually kind of unusual. Mountain goats typically maintain more distance from areas with regular human activity. I wonder if something else has them concentrated up here." "What do you mean?" Kevin asked, though his wildlife biology background already suggested several possibilities. "Well, if there's predator activity lower down, prey animals often move to higher ground where they feel safer. Or if there's been human disturbance in their normal habitat areas, they might shift their patterns," Ashley explained, continuing to observe the goats through her camera's viewfinder. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of voices carrying along the trail from behind them. The Johnson family was approaching, their children's enthusiastic bear calls echoing through the forest. Kevin and Ashley decided to continue their hike, hoping to reach the alpine meadows near Granite Park Chalet, where they expected to find optimal conditions for wildlife observation and photography. As the morning progressed toward 9 o'clock, Martha maintained her steady pace along the increasingly spectacular sections of the Highline Trail. The path had climbed above the tree line in several areas, offering unobstructed views across vast wilderness expanses that stretched to the horizon in all directions. To the north, the jagged peaks of the Canadian Rockies rose against a clear blue sky, while eastward, the rolling prairies of Montana extended beyond the immediate mountain ranges. Martha paused at a particularly stunning viewpoint where the trail skirted the edge of a dramatic cliff face, hundreds of feet of open air dropping away to a valley floor far below. This section of the trail required careful attention to foot placement, as the path narrowed to less than 3 feet wide in some areas, with loose rock that could shift unexpectedly under a hiker's weight. She had navigated this section dozens of times over the years, but never became complacent about the inherent dangers of high mountain travel. The views from this exposed section were among the most spectacular in all of Glacier National Park, encompassing multiple mountain ranges, pristine alpine lakes, and vast expanses of wilderness that appeared virtually unchanged from their condition centuries earlier. Martha pulled out her camera and took several photographs, trying to capture the play of morning light across distant peaks and the incredible sense of scale that made human presence seem insignificant against the backdrop of geological time. As she prepared to continue hiking, Martha noticed movement in the valley below that caught her attention. Through her small binoculars, she could make out what appeared to be a large, dark animal moving through the trees, approximately 1,000 feet below her position. The animal's size and gait suggested it might be a bear, though the distance made positive identification impossible. She watched for several minutes, but the creature disappeared into dense forest cover without providing a clear view. This sighting, while not unusual in prime grizzly habitat, represented the kind of wildlife encounter that reinforced the importance of maintaining constant awareness while hiking alone in bear country. Martha made a mental note to be especially vigilant over the next section of trail, where the path descended through dense forest that could potentially conceal large animals until very close encounters became unavoidable. The trail ahead wound through a series of gradually descending switchbacks as it dropped from the exposed alpine areas into thicker forest cover, approaching the Granite Park area. This section represented some of the most challenging terrain for maintaining wildlife awareness, as dense vegetation on both sides of the trail created numerous blind spots where animals could remain hidden until hikers passed within extremely close proximity. Martha's standard practice in such terrain involved making frequent noise, moving slowly around blind corners, and maintaining her bear spray in an immediately accessible position. She understood that most wildlife encounters could be avoided through proper precautions, but also recognized that solo hiking inevitably involved accepting certain levels of risk that could not be completely eliminated through any amount of preparation or experience. At approximately 9:20 in the morning, Martha entered a particularly dense section of forest where towering alpine firs created deep shadows despite the bright sunshine above the canopy. The trail surface became softer here, covered with a thick layer of pine needles and organic debris that muffled the sound of footsteps. This natural sound dampening made it more difficult for both hikers and wildlife to detect each other's presence until very close proximity. The forest understory in this area consisted primarily of various berry-producing shrubs, including huckleberries, serviceberries, and mountain ash, all of which represented important food sources for bears during the summer foraging season. Martha could see evidence of recent bear activity in the form of broken branches, scattered berry remnants, and occasional claw marks on tree bark where bears had marked their territory or climbed in search of food. As she navigated a sharp turn in the trail around a massive boulder, Martha suddenly detected a strong, musky odor that immediately triggered her alertness to possible wildlife presence. The scent was heavy and wild, distinctly different from the clean forest aromas of pine and earth that normally characterized mountain environments. Her decades of wilderness experience immediately recognized this as the characteristic smell associated with large carnivores, specifically bears. Martha stopped immediately and listened intently for any sounds that might indicate animal presence in the immediate vicinity. The forest seemed unusually quiet, with none of the typical bird songs or small animal sounds that normally provided background noise during daylight hours. This unnatural silence often indicated the presence of a large predator that had caused other wildlife to become cautious and still. Standing motionless on the trail, Martha carefully scanned the dense vegetation on both sides of the path, looking for any movement or unnatural shapes that might indicate a concealed animal. The thick understory made visual detection extremely difficult beyond a few yards in any direction, creating the unsettling sensation of being potentially observed by invisible eyes from multiple possible hiding spots. After several minutes of careful listening and observation, Martha decided to make her presence known by calling out loudly and clapping her hands, following standard protocols for alerting bears to human presence and providing them with opportunities to leave the area before direct encounters became necessary. Her voice echoed through the forest as she called, "Hey bear, human on the trail," in a calm but loud tone designed to carry through the dense vegetation. The response to Martha's calls came not as the sound of a retreating animal, but as a subtle rustling in the dense huckleberry bushes approximately 30 yards ahead and slightly to the left of the trail. The movement was too large and deliberate to be caused by small animals or wind, suggesting the presence of something substantial within the vegetation. Martha felt her pulse quicken as she realized she had likely detected the presence of a bear in extremely close proximity. Following her wilderness training, Martha slowly backed away from the source of the sound while continuing to speak in calm, steady tones. "Easy, bear. I'm just passing through. I'm going to back away and give you plenty of space." She avoided direct eye contact with the area where she had detected movement. A sustained eye contact could be interpreted as aggressive behavior by bears and potentially trigger defensive responses. The rustling in the bushes continued, accompanied by what sounded like heavy breathing or snuffling sounds, characteristic of a large animal investigating scents in the area. Martha could hear the distinctive sound of branches breaking under significant weight as something moved through the dense vegetation, apparently paralleling her position along the trail rather than moving away as she had hoped. Martha's training and experience told her that most bear encounters could be resolved peacefully by providing the animal with space and avoiding behaviors that might trigger defensive or predatory responses. However, the sounds she was hearing suggested a bear that was not immediately retreating, despite her attempts to make her presence known and provide opportunities for the animal to leave the area safely. As the sounds of movement through the vegetation continued, Martha made the decision to slowly retreat further back along the trail to a more open area where she would have better visibility and maneuverability if the situation developed into a direct encounter. She moved carefully, avoiding sudden movements while keeping her bear spray readily accessible and her eyes focused on the area where she had detected the animal's presence. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Martha slowly backed along the trail, the normal sounds of wilderness life remaining conspicuously absent. Even the wind seemed to have stilled, creating an eerie silence broken only by her own careful footsteps and the occasional rustling from the hidden animal that continued to move through the vegetation roughly parallel to her position. At approximately 9:25 in the morning, the situation that Martha had spent 40 years of wilderness hiking, hoping to avoid, was about to unfold with devastating suddenness. The large male grizzly that had been foraging in the huckleberry patch finally emerged from the dense vegetation directly onto the trail, approximately 25 yards ahead of Martha's position, presenting both hiker and bear with a direct visual encounter that would trigger a sequence of events lasting exactly 7 minutes and forever changing multiple lives. The bear stood motionless on the trail for several seconds, his massive head raised as he tested the air for scent information about the human presence he had detected. At 650 pounds and standing nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder, while on all fours, the grizzly represented the apex predator of North American wilderness, possessing the physical capabilities to run at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour and the strength to overturn automobiles when motivated to do so. Martha froze completely as she found herself facing the largest grizzly bear she had ever encountered in decades of wilderness hiking. The animal's sheer size was overwhelming, far exceeding her previous experiences with the smaller black bears and occasional distant grizzly sightings that had characterized her wilderness encounters over the years. His massive shoulders rippled with muscle beneath a thick coat of dark brown fur tipped with silver, while his large head and pronounced facial features indicated a mature male in his prime. The bear's small, dark eyes fixed on Martha's position, with the intense focus of a predator evaluating a potential threat or opportunity. Unlike the quick retreat behavior typically exhibited by bears when surprised by human presence, this animal showed no immediate inclination to flee. Instead, he remained stationary on the trail, his body language suggesting alertness and assessment, rather than the fear or avoidance that characterized most wildlife encounters. Martha slowly reached for her bear spray, while avoiding any sudden movements that might be interpreted as aggressive by the enormous animal facing her. Her decades of wilderness experience had taught her that most bear encounters could be resolved through calm, non-threatening behavior that allowed the animal to retreat without feeling cornered or challenged. However, the size and demeanor of this particular bear suggested a level of confidence and lack of human avoidance that made the situation potentially much more dangerous than typical wildlife encounters. The standoff continued for approximately 30 seconds, with both human and bear remaining motionless while assessing the situation. Martha could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as adrenaline flooded her system, her body preparing for whatever might develop from this unprecedented encounter. The bear's breathing was audible, even at 25 yards distance, deep and deliberate as he continued to evaluate the human presence that had interrupted his morning foraging activities. During these crucial seconds, Martha made the decision that her wilderness training had prepared her for, beginning to speak in calm, steady tones while slowly backing away from the bear's position. "Easy, big guy. I'm just passing through. I'm going to back away and give you plenty of room." Her voice remained controlled despite the fear coursing through her body, following protocols designed to de-escalate potentially dangerous wildlife encounters. The bear's response to Martha's retreat was not what 4 decades of wilderness experience had taught her to expect. Rather than taking the opportunity to leave the area, the massive grizzly began moving forward along the trail, closing the distance that Martha was attempting to create. His movement was deliberate and purposeful, lacking the quick, startled retreat behavior that typically characterized surprised bears encountered by hikers. Martha's training had prepared her for various scenarios in bear encounters, but the behavior she was witnessing fell outside the normal patterns of wildlife response to human presence. The bear was neither fleeing nor displaying obvious defensive behaviors, but instead appeared to be actively approaching her position. This represented the nightmare scenario that wilderness experts acknowledged as possible but statistically rare. A situation where a large predator might view a solitary human as potential prey rather than a threat to be avoided. As the distance between them decreased from 25 yards to approximately 20 yards, Martha made the decision to deploy her bear spray, though she was still outside the effective range for the defensive device. Bear spray typically required target distances of 10 yards or less to be effective, meaning she would need the bear to come significantly closer before the deterrent could be successfully employed. The bear continued his deliberate approach along the trail, his massive paws making surprisingly little sound on the soft forest floor despite his enormous weight. His gait remained controlled and purposeful, suggesting a level of comfort with human presence that indicated either extensive previous encounters or a lack of the natural wariness that kept most grizzlies safely away from human activities. Martha continued backing along the trail while maintaining visual contact with the approaching bear, following wilderness protocols that emphasized avoiding running, which could trigger predatory chase responses in large carnivores. However, her retreat was limited by the terrain behind her, as the trail in this area was bordered by dense vegetation and steep slopes that would make off-trail movement extremely difficult and potentially more dangerous than remaining on the established path. At approximately 9:26 in the morning, when the distance between Martha and the grizzly had decreased to roughly 15 yards, the bear's behavior suddenly shifted from deliberate approach to what wildlife experts would later classify as predatory stalking behavior. The massive animal lowered his head and began moving with increased speed and obvious intent, transforming what had been a tense but potentially manageable wildlife encounter into an imminent attack situation. Martha recognized the change in the bear's demeanor immediately and made the split-second decision that her survival depended upon. She raised her bear spray canister and activated the trigger, sending a cone of capsaicin-based deterrent toward the approaching grizzly while simultaneously beginning to back away more rapidly. However, The distance was still too great for the spray to be fully effective, and the bear's momentum carried him through the outer edges of the deterrent cloud without significant impact. The failure of the bear spray to stop or deter the approaching grizzly left Martha with rapidly diminishing options as the massive predator continued closing the distance between them. Her wilderness training had always emphasized that running from bears typically triggered chase responses that could result in overtaking a fleeing human within seconds, but the alternative of standing her ground against an approaching 650-pound predator seemed equally futile. The bear's speed increased dramatically as he committed to his approach, demonstrating the incredible athleticism that allowed grizzlies to run at speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour despite their massive size. His powerful legs drove his enormous body forward with surprising grace, covering ground with long, purposeful strides that eliminated the remaining distance between predator and prey with terrifying efficiency. Martha attempted to deploy her backup bear spray canister while continuing to retreat, but the bear's rapid approach left insufficient time for effective use of the second deterrent device. The situation that she had spent decades preparing for through wilderness training and safety precautions was unfolding with a speed and intensity that exceeded her ability to implement defensive measures successfully. At exactly 9:27 in the morning, the massive grizzly bear closed the final distance to Martha Phillips and initiated an attack that would continue for 7 minutes of unimaginable violence and terror. The bear's initial contact knocked Martha to the ground with tremendous force, his weight and momentum completely overwhelming her 71-year-old frame, despite her excellent physical condition and decades of wilderness experience. The force of the initial impact drove Martha backwards off the trail and into the dense vegetation, where her screams for help would be muffled by the forest canopy and unlikely to reach other hikers who might be within hearing range. The bear's massive claws, designed for digging through frozen ground and stripping bark from trees, tore through Martha's hiking clothes and into her flesh with devastating effect. Martha's extensive wilderness training had included information about surviving bear attacks through passive resistance, playing dead by lying face down with hands protecting the neck and remaining motionless until the animal lost interest and departed. However, the ferocity and persistence of this particular attack quickly made clear that the bear's behavior represented predatory rather than defensive aggression, requiring active resistance rather than passive submission. The grizzly's attacks focused initially on Martha's upper body and head, areas that bears typically target when exhibiting predatory behavior toward potential prey. His massive jaws, capable of exerting bite pressure exceeding 800 pounds per square inch, inflicted crushing injuries that would have been immediately fatal in most circumstances. However, Martha's position relative to the bear's attack angle and her attempts to protect vital areas with her arms and backpack resulted in severe but not immediately lethal trauma. Martha's screams echoed through the forest as she fought desperately against an opponent whose physical capabilities exceeded human resistance by overwhelming margins. Her attempts to use rocks and sticks as defensive weapons proved futile against an animal whose thick fur and massive bone structure provided natural armor against such improvised deterrents. The bear's weight, distributed across her smaller frame, made breathing extremely difficult while his claws and teeth continued inflicting devastating injuries. The attack continued with unrelenting ferocity as the massive grizzly demonstrated the predatory persistence that made such encounters almost inevitably fatal for human victims. Unlike defensive attacks that typically ended within seconds, once the perceived threat was neutralized, this assault continued minute after minute as the bear attempted to subdue what he apparently perceived as prey rather than a threat requiring brief defensive action. Martha's attempts to escape were thwarted by the dense vegetation surrounding the attack site and her rapidly diminishing physical capabilities as blood loss and traumatic injuries began affecting her strength and coordination. The forest understory that had provided such beautiful scenery during her morning hike now became a trap that prevented effective flight while concealing the ongoing attack from potential rescuers who might be within the general area. The bear's behavior during the extended attack displayed the calculated efficiency of a large predator subduing prey rather than the brief defensive violence typically associated with surprised or threatened bears. His attacks targeted vital areas systematically, attempting to disable his victim's ability to resist or escape while inflicting maximum physical trauma. This pattern of behavior, while extremely rare in grisly human encounters, represented the nightmare scenario that wilderness experts acknowledged as possible when large predators perceived solitary humans as potential food sources. As the attack entered its third minute, Martha's resistance began to weaken significantly due to blood loss and the accumulated trauma of multiple severe injuries. Her screams, which had initially carried clearly through the forest, became weaker and more intermittent as her physical condition deteriorated rapidly. The bear's continued aggression showed no signs of diminishing, despite her obvious inability to pose any threat to his massive size and strength. The dense forest vegetation that surrounded the attack site absorbed much of the sound generated by the ongoing violence, reducing the likelihood that Martha's cries for help would reach other hikers who might be within the general area. The Johnson family, approximately half a mile behind on the trail, continued their leisurely hike with their children while remaining unaware of the life-and-death struggle taking place ahead of them. During the fourth minute of the attack, the bear's behavior began to show characteristics that wildlife experts would later identify as feeding behavior rather than continued defensive or predatory aggression. The massive grizzly had apparently concluded that his victim was sufficiently subdued to pose no further resistance, and his actions transitioned from attack to consumption as he began to treat Martha as a food source rather than a threat requiring neutralization. This behavioral transition represented the most horrific aspect of predatory bear attacks, as victims who survived the initial assault phase often remained conscious during the early stages of feeding behavior. Martha's wilderness training had included general information about such scenarios, but no amount of theoretical knowledge could have prepared her for the reality of experiencing such trauma while remaining aware of what was happening to her body. The bear's feeding behavior focused initially on areas where his attacks had already created significant tissue damage, following the natural patterns of large predators consuming prey. His powerful jaws and sharp teeth, evolved for processing various food sources from vegetation to large mammals, proved devastatingly effective against human anatomy, despite the obvious evolutionary mismatch between grizzly bears and human prey. Martha's consciousness began to fade intermittently during the fifth minute of the attack as blood loss and trauma began affecting her brain function. However, the survival instincts developed over millions of years of human evolution continued driving her attempts to escape or resist, even as her physical capabilities diminished beyond any reasonable hope of effective self-defense against such an overwhelmingly powerful opponent. The forest around the attack site remained eerily quiet, except for the sounds of the ongoing violence as other wildlife had fled the area upon detecting the presence of an active large predator. This natural response to apex predator activity meant that Martha's ordeal was taking place in relative isolation, with little chance of intervention by other animals that might potentially distract or deter the attacking bear. As the attack entered its sixth minute, Martha's movements became increasingly weak and uncoordinated as the combination of blood loss, trauma, and oxygen deprivation began shutting down her body's systems. Her attempts to call for help became barely audible whispers that would have been inaudible beyond a few yards, even in perfect conditions, much less through the dense forest vegetation that surrounded the attack site. The bear continued his feeding behavior with the methodical efficiency characteristic of large predators, his actions guided by millions of years of evolutionary adaptation for processing various food sources. The massive grizzly showed no awareness of the moral implications of his actions from a human perspective, following instead the biological imperatives that had enabled his species to survive and thrive in harsh wilderness environments for millennia. During the seventh and final minute of the attack, Martha Phillips's consciousness faded permanently as her 71-year-old body succumbed to injuries that would have been fatal to individuals half her age and in perfect physical condition. Her remarkable fitness and decades of wilderness experience had enabled her to survive longer than most people would have under similar circumstances, but ultimately proved insufficient against the overwhelming physical capabilities of a 650-pound apex predator. The massive grizzly continued his feeding behavior for several additional minutes after Martha's death, following natural patterns of predator behavior that maximized nutritional benefit from successful hunts. His actions during this period would later provide crucial evidence for wildlife investigators attempting to understand the circumstances and behavioral factors that had contributed to this extremely rare but devastating human-wildlife conflict. At approximately 9:34 in the morning, exactly 7 minutes after the initial contact, Martha Phillips's ordeal finally ended. The experienced hiker who had spent 4 decades safely exploring some of North America's most challenging wilderness areas had encountered the one scenario that no amount of preparation or experience could guarantee surviving. Her death would impact not only her immediate family, but also the broader wilderness community and wildlife management policies throughout the region. The bear's behavior following the conclusion of the attack followed patterns typical of large predators after successful hunts, with the massive grizzly remaining in the immediate area to continue feeding and guard his kill from potential scavengers. This territorial behavior around food sources represented normal grizzly conduct that would significantly complicate rescue efforts once Martha's absence was discovered and search operations were initiated. Meanwhile, the Johnson family continued their hike along the Highline Trail, still approximately 20 minutes behind Martha's last known position. Their leisurely pace and frequent stops had prevented them from witnessing the attack or providing any potential assistance during the critical 7-minute period when intervention might have been possible. The family remained unaware that they were approaching an area where a large predator had just made a kill and was likely to exhibit highly territorial behavior regarding the feeding site. Kevin Martinez and Ashley Chen had also continued their hike toward the Granite Park area, their focus on wildlife observation and photography, keeping them unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded behind them on the trail. Their advanced wildlife biology training would later prove valuable in providing expert testimony about bear behavior patterns and environmental factors that might have contributed to the attack, but their knowledge could not prevent an encounter they never witnessed. The forest gradually returned to its normal patterns of wildlife activity as the immediate excitement of the predator attack subsided. Birds began calling again from safe distances, while smaller mammals cautiously resumed their daily activities while maintaining awareness of the large carnivore that had established dominance over the immediate area. The natural world continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the human tragedy that had just concluded within its boundaries. Martha's body lay in the dense undergrowth approximately 15 yards from the main trail, positioned where the bear had dragged her during the initial phase of the attack. The location would later prove challenging for search and rescue teams to locate, as the thick vegetation effectively concealed the site from casual observation by passing hikers, while the bear's continued presence in the area created additional safety concerns for potential rescuers. The hiking gear that Martha had carried during her final adventure lay scattered throughout the attack site, much of it damaged or destroyed during the violent encounter. Her carefully maintained backpack, containing emergency supplies and safety equipment accumulated over decades of wilderness hiking, had proven insufficient protection against circumstances that exceeded the design parameters of any reasonable safety preparations. Martha's camera, containing her final photographs of the spectacular mountain scenery she had come to witness, lay damaged among the scattered remnants of her hiking gear. The images stored in its memory card would later provide investigators with a timeline of her final morning and evidence of the normal wildlife activity that had characterized the early portions of her hike before the encounter with the aggressive grizzly bear. By 10 o'clock in the morning, Martha Phillips had been missing from the trail for over 30 minutes, though her absence would not be discovered for several more hours. The Johnson family continued approaching the area where the attack had occurred, while Kevin Martinez and Ashley Chen had reached the alpine meadows near Granite Park Chalet, where they were documenting wildlife behavior patterns in the high country environment. The massive grizzly bear remained in the immediate vicinity of the attack site, following behavioral patterns that would keep him in the area for several hours as he defended his kill from potential scavengers and continued feeding. His presence would later complicate initial rescue efforts and require the involvement of wildlife management specialists before human recovery operations could safely proceed in the area. Park rangers at various locations throughout Glacier National Park continued their normal duties, unaware that one of the statistical improbabilities that wilderness managers hoped never to encounter had just occurred on one of the park's most popular hiking trails. The administrative machinery that would eventually respond to Martha's disappearance remained inactive, while the clock ticked toward the time when her absence would trigger increasingly urgent search and rescue operations. The weather remained perfect for hiking throughout the morning, with clear skies and comfortable temperatures that would have made Martha's final day in the mountains everything she had hoped for under different circumstances. The spectacular scenery that had drawn her back to Glacier National Park for over 4 decades continued to provide inspiration and beauty for other visitors, while concealing the tragedy that had unfolded in a small section of dense forest away from the main trail. At approximately 10:15 in the morning, the Johnson family reached the section of the Highline Trail where Martha had encountered the grizzly bear 45 minutes earlier. The bear had moved slightly away from the immediate trail area, but remained within the general vicinity, creating a potentially dangerous situation as the family approached with their 3 children, ranging from 8 to 16 years old. Michael Johnson's medical training and wilderness experience made him naturally alert to environmental conditions that might indicate safety concerns, and he noticed several subtle signs that triggered his attention as the family hiked through the area. The unusual quietness of the forest, the absence of normal bird activity, and a faint but distinctive odor in the air suggested the possible presence of large wildlife in the immediate vicinity. "Everyone stay close together," Michael instructed his family as they moved through the section of trail where Martha had made her final stand. "I think there might be a bear somewhere in this area. Keep making noise and stay alert." Lisa Johnson gathered their 3 children closer, while Michael scanned the dense vegetation on both sides of the trail, his eyes searching for any movement or unusual shapes that might indicate concealed wildlife. The family's noise-making efforts, which had been enthusiastic but intermittent during the earlier portions of their hike, became more consistent and louder as they sensed the potential for wildlife encounters. 8-year-old Emma Johnson continued her assigned task of calling "Hey Bear" with renewed enthusiasm, while her older siblings maintained closer positions near their parents. The family's group dynamics provided significantly better protection against potential wildlife encounters than Martha's solo hiking had offered, though their presence in the area where a large predator had recently made a kill created inherent risks that no safety precautions could completely eliminate. The massive grizzly bear detected the approach of the Johnson family through his acute senses of hearing and smell, which far exceeded human capabilities for environmental awareness. His behavioral response to this new human presence would be influenced by his recent feeding activity and territorial instincts regarding protecting his kill from potential competitors or threats. Unlike his encounter with Martha, where surprise and individual vulnerability had contributed to predatory behavior, the bear's response to a larger, noisier group of humans followed more typical grizzly patterns of avoiding contact when possible rather than engaging in confrontational behavior. The family's group dynamics and noise-making efforts provided them with protection that solo hikers could not achieve regardless of their experience level or safety preparations. The bear moved deeper into the forest understory as the Johnson family passed through the area, following his natural inclination to avoid human contact when not surprised or threatened. This behavioral difference highlighted the importance of group hiking and noise-making in bear country, safety measures that Martha had been unable to implement during her solo adventure despite her decades of wilderness experience and comprehensive safety preparations. The Johnson family completed their passage through the danger area without ever seeing the massive grizzly bear that had killed Martha Phillips less than an hour earlier. Their continued hike toward Granite Park Chalet proceeded normally, with no indication that they had just passed within a few hundred yards of a fresh kill site where a large predator might still be feeding. Michael Johnson's sense of unease about the area persisted even after they had moved well past the section where he had detected potential signs of bear presence. His wilderness experience suggested that something significant had occurred in that location, though he could not identify specific evidence to support his intuition. The family continued their hike with heightened alertness while maintaining their planned route toward the high alpine areas near Granite Park. Meanwhile, Kevin Martinez and Ashley Chen had reached their intended destination in the alpine meadows several miles ahead, where they were documenting the behavior of a small herd of mountain goats that had been displaced from their normal territory by unknown factors. Their wildlife biology training helped them recognize that the animals' behavior patterns suggested recent disturbance in their usual habitat areas, though they could not determine the specific cause of the displacement. "These goats are definitely avoiding their normal range," Ashley observed, while photographing the animals with her telephoto lens. "They're staying much higher on the slopes than usual for this time of day." Kevin nodded while making notes in his field journal. "Something's got them spooked down lower. Could be predator activity, or maybe human disturbance from increased hiking traffic this season." Their scientific training and systematic observation methods were providing them with data that would later prove valuable in understanding the environmental factors surrounding Martha's death, though they remained unaware of the tragedy that had occurred several miles behind them on the trail. Their research would eventually contribute to wildlife management decisions aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. By 11 o'clock in the morning, Martha Phillips had been dead for over an hour and a half, though her absence had not yet been discovered by anyone in a position to initiate search and rescue operations. The timeline for reporting missing hikers typically allowed for significant delays, as experienced wilderness travelers were expected to handle minor emergencies independently and might reasonably be several hours behind their planned schedules for various legitimate reasons. The staff at Martha's Hotel in West Glacier would not expect her return until late afternoon at the earliest, based on the itinerary information she had provided when checking in. Her planned route to Granite Park Chalet and return represented a full day's hiking for someone of any age, and delays due to weather, wildlife encounters, or simply taking extra time to enjoy the scenery were considered normal variations in wilderness travel. Martha's adult children in Minneapolis had no expectation of hearing from their mother during her hiking day, as cell phone service was extremely limited throughout most of Glacier National Park, and communication during wilderness activities was not part of their normal routine. David and Sarah Phillips continued their own daily activities while assuming their mother was enjoying another successful day in the mountains she loved. The massive grizzly bear had settled into a pattern of intermittent feeding and resting near the kill site, following behavioral norms for large predators after successful hunts. His continued presence in the area would complicate eventual recovery efforts, as wildlife management protocols required ensuring human safety before allowing access to areas where dangerous animals might be present. The forest around the attack site had returned to normal patterns of wildlife activity, with birds and small mammals resuming their daily routines while maintaining appropriate caution regarding the large predator in their vicinity. The natural world's rapid adaptation to changing circumstances demonstrated the resilience of wilderness ecosystems, even in the aftermath of dramatic predatory events. Other hikers continued using the Highline Trail throughout the morning, most passing through the general area of the attack without detecting any signs of the tragedy that had occurred. The trail's design and the dense vegetation surrounding the kill site effectively concealed evidence of the encounter from casual observation by passing visitors who had no reason to investigate areas away from the maintained path. At approximately 11:30 in the morning, a group of experienced backpackers from Seattle noticed what appeared to be torn fabric caught on branches near the trail, though they did not investigate the discovery thoroughly enough to realize its significance. The fabric represented remnants of Martha's hiking clothing that had been scattered during the attack, but without additional evidence, the backpackers assumed it was simply litter left by careless visitors. The Seattle hiking group, consisting of 4 adults with extensive wilderness experience, briefly discussed whether they should remove the fabric as part of leave no trace principles, but decided against venturing into the dense undergrowth where it was located. Their decision to continue hiking without investigating further was reasonable given the information available to them, though it represented a missed opportunity for earlier discovery of Martha's disappearance. As noon approached, the beautiful weather conditions that had characterized Martha's final morning began to change as afternoon cloud formations developed over the high peaks surrounding the area. The potential for afternoon thunderstorms, common in the Rocky Mountain region during summer months, would later complicate search and rescue operations if Martha's absence was discovered during the period when weather conditions were less favorable for aviation support. The Johnson family reached the Granite Park Chalet area shortly before noon, having completed the more challenging sections of their planned hike without further wildlife encounters. Their experience passing through the area where Martha had been killed provided them with no indication of the tragedy, though Michael Johnson's continued unease about that particular section of trail would later contribute to his detailed recollections when questioned by investigators. Kevin Martinez and Ashley Chen continued their wildlife research in the alpine areas, documenting animal behavior patterns that would eventually provide valuable scientific data about ecosystem responses to predatory activity. Their systematic approach to field research was generating information that would help wildlife managers better understand the environmental factors that might contribute to dangerous human-wildlife conflicts. The massive grizzly bear remained in the general vicinity of the kill site, though his exact location varied as he moved through the dense forest while maintaining territorial control over the area. His presence would continue to pose safety risks for anyone who might discover Martha's remains, requiring careful coordination between search and rescue personnel and wildlife management specialists. At exactly 12:15 in the afternoon, Martha Phillips had been missing for over 3 hours, though this timeline remained unknown to anyone in a position to initiate emergency response procedures. The beautiful July day continued to unfold for hundreds of other park visitors, while one family in Minneapolis continued their normal Saturday activities, unaware that their world was about to be forever changed by events occurring in a remote section of wilderness 2,000 miles away. The discovery that would eventually trigger the massive search and rescue operation was still several hours away, as the circumstances necessary for someone to realize Martha was missing had not yet developed. The afternoon would bring new hikers to the area, changing weather conditions, and eventually the realization that an experienced wilderness traveler had failed to return from what should have been a routine day hike on familiar trails. Martha's final morning in the wilderness she had loved for over 4 decades had ended in circumstances that no amount of preparation or experience could have prevented. Her death would ultimately lead to significant changes in wildlife management policies, increased awareness of solo hiking risks, and ongoing research into the factors that occasionally cause large predators to view humans as prey rather than threats to be avoided. The clock continued ticking toward the afternoon hours when Martha's absence would be discovered, setting in motion a complex chain of events involving multiple agencies, dozens of personnel, and resources extending across several states. The search for Martha Phillips would become one of the most extensive wildlife-related emergency operations in the history of Glacier National Park, ultimately concluding with discoveries that would forever change how wilderness managers approached human safety in areas with large predator populations. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the first subtle signs that something might be wrong began to emerge, though these indications were not immediately recognized as cause for alarm. A trail maintenance crew working in the Granite Park area noticed an unusual concentration of ravens and other scavenging birds circling over a section of forest several miles back along the Highline Trail, behavior that sometimes indicated the presence of carrion or other food sources that attracted scavenger activity. The maintenance crew, consisting of 3 experienced Park Service employees who had worked in Glacier for multiple seasons, briefly discussed the bird activity but concluded it likely represented normal wildlife behavior related to seasonal food sources or perhaps the remains of a natural predator kill. Their assumption was entirely reasonable given the information available to them, though it represented another missed opportunity for earlier discovery of Martha's fate. Meanwhile, the afternoon shift at the hotel in West Glacier, where Martha was staying, began their normal duties, with no reason to be concerned about her absence. Hotel staff understood that guests on extended day hikes frequently returned much later than originally planned, especially during summer months when extended daylight hours encouraged longer wilderness adventures. Martha's room key remained at the front desk where she had left it, and her personal belongings in the room showed no signs that would trigger concern from housekeeping staff. The weather conditions that had been perfect during Martha's morning hike began to deteriorate as typical afternoon mountain weather patterns developed. Cumulus clouds building over the high peaks indicated the potential for thunderstorms later in the day, a common occurrence during summer months that could significantly complicate any search and rescue operations that might become necessary. At the Highline Trail trailhead at Logan Pass, The afternoon shift of park rangers began their duties with normal briefings about trail conditions, wildlife activity reports, and weather forecasts. The information available to them included routine advisories about bear activity in various areas of the park, but nothing that suggested immediate safety concerns beyond the standard precautions recommended for all wilderness travel in grizzly habitat. The massive grizzly bear that had killed Martha Phillips continued to remain in the general area of the attack site, though his specific location varied as he moved through his territory while maintaining awareness of the kill site that represented a significant food source. His behavioral patterns followed normal grizzly protocols for guarding valuable resources from potential competitors or scavengers. The Johnson family completed their planned hiking route and began their return journey along the Highline Trail, retracing their morning route back toward Logan Pass. Their return trip would take them past the area where Martha had been killed, potentially providing another opportunity for discovery, though the dense forest vegetation continued to effectively conceal the attack site from casual observation. As the Johnson family approached the section of trail where Michael had detected signs of possible bear presence during the morning, his alertness increased based on his earlier intuition that something significant had occurred in that location. However, the bear's movement away from the immediate trail area during the intervening hours meant that the obvious indicators of predator presence were no longer as apparent to passing hikers. Kevin Martinez and Ashley Chen had completed their planned research activities in the alpine areas and were also beginning their return hike toward Logan Pass. Their scientific training and systematic observation skills would make them more likely than average hikers to notice unusual environmental conditions, though they had no specific reason to investigate areas away from the maintained trail unless something obvious drew their attention. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Martha Phillips had been missing for over 5 hours, though this fact remained unknown to anyone in a position to initiate search procedures. The timeline for reporting missing hikers in wilderness areas typically allowed for much longer delays, as experienced backpackers were expected to be capable of handling various minor emergencies and might legitimately be many hours behind schedule for numerous reasons. The first indication that something might be seriously wrong came from an unexpected source when a group of horseback riders working for a commercial outfitter noticed their animals showing unusual nervousness and reluctance to proceed through a specific section of trail. Horses possess much more sensitive awareness of predator presence than humans, and their behavioral changes often provide early warning of dangerous wildlife encounters. The horse guide, an experienced outfitter named Tom Richardson, who had worked in Glacier National Park for over 15 years, immediately recognized his animal's behavior as indicating the presence of a large predator in the immediate vicinity. His extensive experience with horse behavior in predator situations made him much more capable of interpreting these warning signs than typical park visitors would have been. Richardson made the decision to turn his group around and avoid the area where his horses were showing signs of extreme nervousness, following standard safety protocols for commercial outfitters operating in areas with dangerous wildlife. However, his report to park rangers about the incident would provide the first concrete indication that something significant had occurred in that section of the wilderness. The report from Richardson reached the ranger station at Logan Pass at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, providing park personnel with their first indication that unusual predator activity might be occurring along the Highline Trail. Rangers began reviewing their records of hiking permits and trail registrations to identify anyone who might be in the area of concern. Unfortunately, Martha Phillips had not registered for any permits that would have created an official record of her hiking plans, as day hiking on the Highline Trail did not require advance registration. Her informal notification to hotel staff represented the only documentation of her intended activities, information that was not accessible to park rangers during the initial stages of their investigation. The ranger response to Richardson's report followed standard protocols for investigating potential wildlife incidents, beginning with radio communications to other park personnel in the area and preparations for conducting aerial reconnaissance if weather conditions permitted helicopter operations. However, the developing afternoon storms were beginning to limit aviation options. As the afternoon progressed toward 4 o'clock, multiple factors began converging to create the circumstances that would lead to the discovery of Martha's disappearance. The combination of Richardson's report about unusual predator activity, the continuing concentration of scavenging birds in the area, and the approaching timeline when missing hiker reports might begin to be filed, created a situation where park personnel would soon begin active investigation of the Highline Trail area. The Johnson family completed their return hike and arrived back at Logan Pass in the late afternoon, having successfully completed their planned wilderness adventure without incident. However, Michael Johnson's persistent unease about the section of trail where he had sensed possible bear presence led him to mention his observations to rangers at the Logan Pass Visitor Center. Johnson's report provided additional corroboration for the concerns that were beginning to develop among park personnel, though the information he could provide remained general rather than specific. His medical background and wilderness experience gave credibility to his observations, adding weight to the growing body of evidence that something unusual had occurred along the Highline Trail. Kevin Martinez and Ashley Chen also completed their return hike and were preparing to leave the Logan Pass area when they overheard conversations among park rangers about potential wildlife incidents along the trail they had just completed. Their wildlife biology training made them immediately interested in any situation involving predator behavior, and they offered to provide information about their observations during the day. The systematic documentation that Martinez and Chen had maintained during their wildlife research provided park rangers with detailed information about animal behavior patterns throughout the day, including the unusual displacement of mountain goats from their normal territory. This scientific data helped rangers begin developing a more complete picture of the environmental conditions that had characterized the day's activities. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, the convergence of multiple reports and observations led park rangers to make the decision to conduct a preliminary investigation of the Highline Trail area where unusual activity had been reported. The investigation would begin with radio communications to any park personnel who might be in the area, followed by on-ground reconnaissance if immediate radio contact did not provide satisfactory information. The preliminary investigation quickly established that no park personnel had been working in the specific area of concern, eliminating the possibility that official activities had caused the unusual wildlife behavior that had been reported. This information prompted rangers to begin considering the possibility that a serious incident involving park visitors might have occurred in the area. The first systematic attempt to account for visitors who might be in the potentially dangerous area began with a review of trail registration records, vehicle registrations at various trailheads, and accommodation records for visitors staying in park facilities. However, this process was complicated by the fact that many day hikers, like Martha, did not create official records of their activities. As evening approached and the normal time for day hikers to return from extended trips began to pass, park rangers started monitoring for overdue hikers who might need assistance. The process of identifying missing persons in wilderness areas required balancing legitimate safety concerns against the recognition that experienced hikers often returned later than planned for various acceptable reasons. At approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, nearly 8 hours after Martha Phillips had been killed, The combination of wildlife reports and the approaching deadline for normal hiker return times led park rangers to begin active procedures for investigating potential emergency situations along the Highline Trail. The investigation would begin with radio communications and progress to more intensive search methods if initial inquiries did not resolve the apparent discrepancies. The radio communications conducted by park rangers throughout the Highline Trail area failed to make contact with any hikers who might still be on the trail, though this result was not necessarily indicative of problems, since many wilderness areas had limited radio coverage, and hikers were not required to carry communication equipment. However, the lack of radio contact combined with the wildlife reports created sufficient concern to justify more active investigation. The decision to conduct ground-based reconnaissance of the area where unusual wildlife activity had been reported was made at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, with experienced rangers preparing to hike into the area equipped with communication equipment and weapons suitable for encounters with dangerous wildlife. The investigation team would include personnel trained in wilderness emergency response and wildlife management. However, the deteriorating weather conditions that had been building throughout the afternoon began to pose significant challenges for search operations. The thunderstorms that commonly developed over the high peaks during summer afternoons were approaching the area, bringing the potential for lightning, heavy rain, and reduced visibility that would make both ground and aerial search operations much more dangerous. The ranger team assigned to investigate the area of concern included Sergeant Patricia Williams, a 20-year veteran of Park Service law enforcement with extensive experience in wilderness emergency response, and wildlife specialist Dr. James Morrison, a biologist with advanced training in large carnivore behavior and management. Their combined expertise represented the highest level of professional capability available for investigating potential human-wildlife conflicts. As the investigation team prepared their equipment and reviewed available information about the potential incident area, additional reports began arriving from other sources that helped establish a more complete timeline of the day's events. The horse guide Tom Richardson provided detailed information about the specific location where his animals had shown signs of extreme nervousness, while other hikers who had passed through the area contributed observations about unusual environmental conditions. The systematic collection of witness reports began to create a picture of unusual wildlife activity concentrated in a specific section of the Highline Trail, with multiple independent sources providing corroborating information about environmental conditions that suggested significant predator presence. However, the investigation team still lacked concrete evidence that any specific incident had occurred. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the investigation team began their hike into the area of concern, equipped with high-powered flashlights, communication equipment, emergency medical supplies, and firearms appropriate for potential encounters with dangerous wildlife. Their mission included locating any evidence of incidents involving park visitors while maintaining their own safety in an area where a large predator might still be present. The weather conditions continued to deteriorate as the investigation team made their way along the Highline Trail, with increasing wind and the first scattered raindrops indicating that the approaching thunderstorms would soon make their work much more difficult. The combination of fading daylight and deteriorating weather created significant challenges for conducting effective search operations in dense forest terrain. Meanwhile, at the hotel in West Glacier, the evening shift began to note that Martha Phillips had not returned from her day hike, though this observation was not yet cause for serious alarm. Hotel staff understood that wilderness emergencies could delay hikers for various reasons, and experienced guests like Martha were typically capable of handling minor problems independently. However, as the evening hours progressed toward the normal time when even extended day hikes should conclude, hotel staff began to consider whether they should attempt to contact park rangers about a potentially overdue guest. The decision-making process was complicated by the balance between appropriate concern for guest safety and avoiding unnecessary emergency responses for situations that might resolve themselves. At approximately 7:30 in the evening, the ranger investigation team reached the general area where multiple reports had indicated unusual wildlife activity. The dense forest vegetation and fading daylight made visual inspection extremely difficult, while the approaching thunderstorm created additional urgency to complete their investigation before weather conditions became dangerous for personnel in exposed locations. The investigation team's first priority involved ensuring their own safety while conducting reconnaissance of an area where a large predator might still be present. Their standard protocols required maintaining constant communication with park headquarters while systematically searching for any evidence of incidents involving park visitors. The team's wildlife specialist, Dr. Morrison, immediately detected strong predator scent in the area, confirming that a large carnivore had been active in the location recently. His experience with grizzly behavior patterns enabled him to recognize that the scent indicated not just the presence of a bear, but specific behavioral patterns associated with feeding activity. The discovery of predator scent associated with feeding behavior transformed the investigation from a routine check on reported wildlife activity into a potential recovery operation for human remains. The investigation team followed emergency protocols for situations involving confirmed predator attacks, establishing communication with park headquarters and requesting additional resources for what might become an extended operation. Sergeant Williams coordinated the expanded response, while Dr. Morrison continued his assessment of the wildlife evidence in the immediate area. The combination of their law enforcement and scientific expertise enabled them to begin developing a preliminary understanding of what had likely occurred, though they still lacked visual confirmation of any specific incident. The first concrete evidence of human presence in the area came when Dr. Morrison discovered scattered remnants of hiking equipment approximately 20 yards from the main trail, concealed within dense undergrowth that would not have been visible to passing hikers. The equipment showed signs of severe damage, consistent with large animal activity, providing the first definitive indication that a serious incident had occurred. At 8 o'clock in the evening, nearly 11 hours after Martha Phillips' death, the investigation team made the discovery that confirmed their worst fears. Sergeant Williams located human remains in dense vegetation approximately 15 yards from the Highline Trail, in a location where they had been concealed from casual observation by passing hikers throughout the day. The discovery site showed clear evidence of extensive bear activity, with tracks, scat, and other signs indicating that a large grizzly had been using the area as a feeding site for several hours. Dr. Morrison's expertise in carnivore behavior enabled him to reconstruct the general sequence of events, though detailed analysis would require additional investigation by specialized personnel. The confirmation of a fatal bear attack on the Highline Trail triggered immediate implementation of emergency protocols that had been developed for such incidents. Park headquarters was notified immediately, leading to the activation of multiple response teams, including additional law enforcement, medical personnel, wildlife management specialists, and administrative officials responsible for coordinating complex emergency operations. The approaching thunderstorm forced the investigation team to establish a secure perimeter around the discovery site while postponing detailed evidence collection until weather conditions improved. The combination of darkness, deteriorating weather, and the continued presence of a large predator in the area made immediate comprehensive investigation impossible. The initial radio report from Sergeant Williams to park headquarters at 8:15 in the evening marked the official beginning of what would become one of the most extensive Emergency Operations in Glacier National Park History. The report confirmed the discovery of human remains consistent with a fatal bear attack, requiring immediate activation of protocols for managing such incidents while protecting public safety. Park Superintendent Rebecca Martinez received notification of the incident at her home and immediately began coordinating the multi-agency response that such situations required. Her 25 years of experience in park management had included several previous bear incidents, though none involving fatalities on such popular trails during peak tourist season. The immediate priorities included securing the incident site, coordinating with local law enforcement and medical examiner personnel, implementing temporary trail closures to protect public safety, and beginning the process of notifying relevant family members once victim identification was completed. Each of these tasks required careful coordination among multiple agencies with different jurisdictions and responsibilities. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks was notified immediately due to their jurisdiction over wildlife management issues, particularly those involving dangerous animals that might pose ongoing threats to public safety. Their wildlife specialists would play crucial roles in determining appropriate responses to the bear responsible for the attack. Local law enforcement agencies were also notified due to their responsibilities for death investigation and coordination with medical examiner personnel. The remote location of the incident site would require careful planning for evidence collection and remains recovery. While maintaining the safety of personnel working in an area where dangerous wildlife was present. As the thunderstorm reached the area around 9 o'clock in the evening, the investigation team was forced to retreat to safer locations while maintaining surveillance of the incident site to prevent contamination of evidence. The storm brought heavy rain, lightning, and strong winds that made continued operations in exposed mountain terrain extremely dangerous for personnel. The hotel in West Glacier received notification from park rangers at 9:30 in the evening that one of their guests might be involved in a serious wilderness incident. Hotel staff provided investigators with Martha's registration information and personal belongings from her room, beginning the process of confirming victim identification. The personal items in Martha's hotel room included family photographs, contact information for her children in Minneapolis, and detailed hiking maps that helped investigators understand her planned activities. The information provided crucial evidence for establishing her identity and beginning the process of family notification. At 10 o'clock in the evening, park officials made the preliminary determination that the victim was likely Martha Phillips of Minneapolis, Minnesota, based on the correlation between her known hiking plans and the location where remains had been discovered. However, formal identification would require additional procedures involving medical examiner personnel and possibly forensic specialists. The process of contacting Martha's family members began with careful verification of contact information and coordination with local law enforcement in Minneapolis to ensure that death notification was conducted appropriately. The news that would devastate David and Sarah Phillips was delivered by experienced personnel trained in providing such information to family members. David Phillips received the phone call at his Minneapolis home at 11 o'clock in the evening, Mountain Time, informing him that his mother had been involved in a fatal wilderness incident in Glacier National Park. The shock of learning about Martha's death was compounded by the circumstances of the attack, which exceeded the family's worst fears about her solo hiking activities. Sarah Phillips was contacted immediately after her brother, receiving similar notification about their mother's death. The siblings began the difficult process of coordinating travel to Montana while dealing with the emotional impact of losing their mother in such traumatic circumstances. Their concerns about Martha's solo hiking had proven tragically prophetic. As the night progressed, park personnel maintained security around the incident site while developing plans for comprehensive investigation and remains recovery once weather conditions improved. The continued presence of the bear responsible for the attack created additional complications, as wildlife management protocols required ensuring human safety before allowing detailed forensic work to proceed. The thunderstorm that had forced suspension of field operations gradually moved through the area, though residual weather effects including periodic lightning and heavy rain continued to limit safe working conditions. The investigation team established a command post at a safe distance from the incident site where they could monitor conditions and coordinate expanded operations. Dr. Morrison's preliminary assessment of the incident site provided investigators with crucial information about the bear's behavior patterns and likely future movements. His expertise indicated that the animal would probably remain in the general area for at least 24 to 48 hours, defending the kill site from potential competitors while continuing feeding activities. The implications of having a large predator actively defending a kill site in one of the park's most popular hiking areas required immediate implementation of extensive safety measures. The Highline Trail and surrounding areas would need to be closed to public access until the bear could be located and appropriate management actions taken. At midnight, exactly 15 hours after Martha Phillips's death, park officials issued emergency trail closures for the Highline Trail and adjacent areas, effective immediately and continuing until further notice. The closures would disappoint hundreds of visitors who had planned wilderness adventures, but public safety requirements left no alternatives. The emergency closure notifications were distributed through various channels, including park websites, social media, local news outlets, and direct communication with hotels and outfitters in the area. The extensive communication effort was necessary to ensure that visitors planning activities in the affected areas received adequate warning about the changed conditions. Overnight, additional personnel and equipment arrived at Glacier National Park to support the expanded investigation and recovery operations. The resources included specialized wildlife management experts, additional law enforcement officers, medical examiner personnel, and the equipment necessary for conducting complex operations in remote wilderness areas. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks dispatched their most experienced bear management specialists, including personnel trained in tracking and capturing dangerous animals. Their involvement would be crucial for determining the appropriate response to the bear responsible for the attack, which might include capture and relocation or lethal removal, depending on various factors. The medical examiner's office began coordinating procedures for recovering and examining remains from the remote location, a process that would require helicopter support once weather conditions permitted safe aviation operations. The examination would provide crucial information about the specific circumstances of Martha's death and the bear's behavior patterns during the attack. As dawn approached on July 7th, the complex emergency operation triggered by Martha Phillips's death entered its second day with multiple teams preparing for intensive investigation and recovery activities. The incident would ultimately involve dozens of personnel from multiple agencies and continue for several days before all necessary activities were completed. The weather conditions that had forced suspension of field operations during the night began to improve with the approaching sunrise, though residual cloud cover and periodic rain showers would continue to complicate helicopter operations throughout the early morning hours. Aviation support was crucial for several aspects of the planned operations. At 6 o'clock in the morning on July 7th, exactly 21 hours after Martha's death, the expanded investigation team began their approach to the incident site, equipped with comprehensive resources for conducting detailed examination of the attack area. The team included law enforcement officers, wildlife specialists, medical examiner personnel, and support staff necessary for complex field operations. The bear responsible for the attack was located approximately 100 yards from the original kill site, resting in dense forest cover while maintaining territorial awareness of the area. Dr. Morrison's assessment indicated that the animal showed no signs of abnormal behavior beyond the territorial defense patterns typical of grizzlies guarding food sources. The wildlife management team implemented protocols for managing the dangerous bear while allowing investigation activities to proceed, using specialized equipment and techniques developed for situations involving large predators in proximity to human operations. The procedures required careful coordination to ensure personnel safety while avoiding unnecessary escalation of the situation. The detailed examination of the attack site provided investigators with comprehensive information about the sequence of events that had led to Martha's death. The physical evidence supported Dr. Morrison's preliminary assessment that the incident represented predatory behavior rather than a defensive attack by a surprised or threatened bear. The forensic examination conducted by medical examiner personnel confirmed the identity of the victim as Martha Phillips and established the approximate time and cause of death. The detailed analysis would provide crucial information for understanding the circumstances of the attack and developing improved safety procedures for preventing similar incidents. The bear management team made the decision to attempt capture and relocation of the animal responsible for the attack, following protocols that prioritized removing the immediate threat to public safety while preserving the bear, if possible. However, the capture operation would require sophisticated equipment and techniques due to the animal's size and location in difficult terrain. The attempted capture operation began at approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, using tranquilizer equipment specifically designed for large bears and operated by personnel with extensive experience in wildlife immobilization. The procedure involved significant risks due to the bear's size, location, and behavioral state following the feeding activity. Unfortunately, the capture attempt was unsuccessful due to the bear's movement into terrain that made safe approach impossible for the wildlife management team. The animal's retreat into extremely dense forest cover and steep slopes created conditions where continued pursuit would endanger personnel without reasonable prospects for success. The failure of the capture attempt left wildlife managers with limited options for addressing the continued threat posed by a large predator that had killed a human and remained in the area. The decision-making process involved balancing public safety concerns against wildlife conservation principles and legal requirements for managing park resources. After extensive consultation among wildlife specialists, law enforcement officials, and park administrators, the decision was made to track and eliminate the bear responsible for Martha's death. The decision was based on the animal's demonstrated willingness to attack humans, his continued presence in a popular recreation area, and the impracticality of alternative management approaches. The specialized team assigned to locate and eliminate the dangerous bear included the park's most experienced wildlife personnel and professional hunters, with extensive knowledge of grizzly behavior and tracking techniques. The operation would continue until the specific bear responsible for the attack was definitively located and eliminated. The tracking operation required several additional days due to the bear's movement through extremely difficult terrain and his apparent wariness following the human activity around the kill site. The animal's natural intelligence and wilderness skills made him a formidable opponent even for the most experienced hunters and tracking specialists. On July 10th, 4 days after Martha's death, The bear responsible for the attack was finally located and eliminated by the specialized tracking team in a remote canyon approximately 3 miles from the original incident site. The operation concluded the immediate threat to public safety, though the psychological and administrative impacts of the incident would continue for much longer. The examination of the eliminated bear provided wildlife biologists with valuable information about the factors that might have contributed to his unusually aggressive behavior toward humans. The analysis revealed evidence of previous human food conditioning and several old injuries that might have affected his normal behavioral patterns. The forensic examination of Martha's remains was completed by medical examiner personnel, providing her family with detailed information about the circumstances of her death and enabling funeral arrangements to proceed. The examination confirmed that Martha had fought bravely during the attack and that her extensive wilderness experience had enabled her to survive longer than most people would have under similar circumstances, though ultimately the bear's overwhelming physical advantages had made survival impossible. The completion of the immediate emergency response operations allowed park officials to begin the comprehensive investigation into the factors that had contributed to this extremely rare but devastating incident. The investigation would examine everything from individual decision-making to systemic wildlife management policies, seeking to identify potential improvements that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. The official incident report, compiled over several weeks by a team of specialists from multiple agencies, documented every aspect of Martha's final day and the subsequent emergency response. The report included detailed analysis of weather conditions, wildlife behavior patterns, trail design factors, emergency response procedures, and the effectiveness of various safety measures that had been in place at the time of the incident. Martha's adult children, David and Sarah Phillips, traveled to Montana to handle the practical arrangements necessitated by their mother's death and to gain a better understanding of the circumstances that had led to the tragedy. Their visit included meetings with park officials, examination of the incident site, and discussions with the wildlife specialists who had investigated the attack. The family's questions about their mother's final hours were answered with compassionate honesty by the investigators who had worked on the case. Dr. Morrison and Sergeant Williams provided detailed explanations of the evidence they had discovered, helping David and Sarah understand that Martha had been as prepared as anyone could reasonably be for wilderness hiking, but had encountered circumstances that exceeded any possible level of preparation. The media coverage of Martha's death initially focused on the sensational aspects of a fatal bear attack, but gradually evolved into more thoughtful examination of the complex issues surrounding human activities in large predator habitat. The coverage included interviews with wildlife experts, park officials, and family members who provided different perspectives on the balance between wilderness access and public safety. National news outlets picked up the story due to its occurrence in one of America's most famous national parks during peak tourist season, generating widespread public discussion about the risks associated with wilderness recreation and the appropriate level of government responsibility for protecting park visitors from natural hazards. The publicity surrounding Martha's death led to increased public awareness of bear safety procedures and the inherent risks associated with hiking in large carnivore habitat. Educational materials developed in response to the incident emphasized that while bear attacks remained statistically extremely rare, the consequences of such encounters could be catastrophic regardless of an individual's experience level or preparation. Wilderness advocacy organizations used Martha's death as an opportunity to promote improved safety education for backcountry recreationists, emphasizing that respect for wildlife and understanding of natural hazards were essential components of responsible wilderness use. The incident became a case study in wilderness safety courses throughout the region. The economic impact of the trail closures and negative publicity extended beyond the immediate park area to affect tourism throughout the region. Hotels, restaurants, outfitters, and other businesses dependent on wilderness tourism experienced significant reductions in visitor activity as potential tourists reconsidered their vacation plans in response to news coverage of the attack. Local government officials worked with park administrators to develop communication strategies that acknowledged the reality of wilderness risks, while emphasizing that Glacier National Park remained a safe destination for visitors who followed appropriate safety procedures. The challenge involved balancing honest discussion of hazards with the need to maintain tourism that supported regional economic activity. The legal proceedings that followed Martha's death were relatively limited, as her family chose not to pursue litigation against the National Park Service. David and Sarah Phillips recognized that their mother had been fully aware of the risks associated with solo hiking in bear country and had made informed decisions about accepting those risks in pursuit of activities that brought her great joy. However, the incident did prompt reviews of existing liability policies and safety procedures by park administrators and their legal counsel. The examination included assessment of warning systems, trail design standards, emergency response protocols, and the adequacy of existing safety information provided to park visitors. The psychological impact of Martha's death extended far beyond her immediate family to include the park personnel who had responded to the incident, the investigators who had examined the attack site, and even other visitors who had been hiking in the area during the time period when the attack occurred. Counseling services were made available to anyone affected by the traumatic circumstances. The Johnson family, who had passed through the attack area shortly after Martha's death without realizing what had occurred, experienced significant emotional distress when they learned how close they had come to a potentially similar encounter. Michael Johnson's medical background helped him understand the psychological impact on his children, leading the family to seek professional counseling to process their experience. Kevin Martinez and Ashley Chen, the wildlife biology students who had been conducting research in the area, found their academic interests profoundly affected by their proximity to such a tragic incident. Both students eventually focused their graduate research on human-wildlife conflict issues, seeking to contribute to improved understanding of the factors that occasionally lead to dangerous encounters. The horse guide, Tom Richardson, whose animals had provided the first indication that something was wrong in the area, struggled with questions about whether he could have done anything differently that might have prevented or mitigated the tragedy. His experience and knowledge had enabled him to recognize signs of danger, but the timing and circumstances had not provided opportunities for intervention. The long-term changes implemented in response to Martha's death included enhanced wildlife monitoring systems, improved safety education programs, modified trail design standards in high-risk areas, and expanded training for park personnel responsible for emergency response in wilderness areas. These changes represented Martha's unintended legacy, potentially preventing similar tragedies for future park visitors. The wildlife research initiated in response to the incident provided valuable scientific data about grizzly bear behavior patterns, habitat use, and the environmental factors that might contribute to aggressive encounters with humans. The research included radio collaring studies, genetic analysis of bear populations, and long-term monitoring of individual animals known to frequent areas with high human activity. The memorial service for Martha Phillips, held in Minneapolis 3 weeks after her death, attracted hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her enthusiasm for wilderness exploration. The service included tributes from hiking companions, fellow wilderness advocates, and park personnel who had come to know Martha during her many years of visiting Glacier National Park. David and Sarah Phillips established a memorial fund in their mother's name to support wilderness safety education and research into human-wildlife conflict prevention. The fund would provide grants for educational programs, safety equipment for low-income outdoor enthusiasts, and research projects aimed at reducing the risks associated with wilderness recreation. The annual pilgrimage that Martha had made to Glacier National Park to commemorate her wedding anniversary with Robert was continued by her children, who felt that maintaining this connection to the places their parents had loved represented an appropriate way to honor both their memories. However, their visits included multiple family members and professional guides, rather than the solo hiking that Martha had preferred. The trail where Martha died was eventually reopened to public use after comprehensive safety improvements and enhanced monitoring systems were implemented. The area became the subject of ongoing wildlife research and safety education efforts, with interpretive materials explaining the ecology of large predator habitat and the importance of appropriate precautions for wilderness visitors. The grizzly bear population in Glacier National Park continued to recover from historical suppression, with Martha's death representing one incident in the complex ongoing process of large carnivore conservation in areas where human and wildlife activities overlap. Wildlife managers continued to refine their understanding of bear behavior and develop improved strategies for minimizing conflict while maintaining healthy ecosystems. The Highline Trail remained one of Glacier National Park's most popular hiking destinations, with thousands of visitors annually completing the route that had been Martha's final adventure. Most hikers completed their journeys safely, following improved safety procedures and benefiting from enhanced educational materials developed in response to her death. The story of Martha Phillips became part of the complex narrative of human interaction with wilderness in the American West, illustrating both the profound rewards and serious risks associated with pursuing connections with wild landscapes. Her death served as a reminder that nature remains fundamentally indifferent to human intentions, regardless of experience, preparation, or good intentions. The detailed investigation of Martha's death contributed to a growing body of scientific knowledge about human-wildlife conflicts, providing data that would inform management decisions throughout North America's bear country. The lessons learned from her tragic encounter would potentially benefit countless future wilderness travelers who might face similar situations. The grief experienced by Martha's family evolved over time into a complex mixture of loss, pride in her adventurous spirit, and commitment to continuing her legacy of wilderness advocacy. David and Sarah Phillips became active supporters of outdoor education programs and wildlife conservation efforts, channeling their loss into positive contributions to the wilderness community their mother had loved. The park rangers and wildlife specialists who had responded to Martha's death carried lasting memories of an incident that represented both the most challenging aspects of their professional responsibilities and the importance of their work in protecting both human safety and wildlife conservation. Their experience responding to the tragedy influenced their approach to wilderness management throughout their careers. The annual training programs for park personnel were enhanced to include detailed analysis of Martha's case, providing future rangers with comprehensive understanding of the factors that can contribute to dangerous wildlife encounters and the importance of rapid, coordinated response when such incidents occur. The case became a standard component of wilderness emergency response training. The seasonal rhythm of Glacier National Park continued as it had for millennia, with each summer bringing new visitors to experience the spectacular landscapes that had drawn Martha Phillips for over 4 decades. The cycles of wildlife activity, plant growth, and weather patterns remained fundamentally unchanged by human tragedy, illustrating the enduring power and indifference of natural systems. The scientific understanding of grizzly bear behavior continued to evolve through ongoing research that built upon the data collected during the investigation of Martha's death. New techniques for monitoring individual animals and predicting potential conflict situations were developed and implemented, contributing to improved safety for both humans and wildlife in shared landscapes. The memorial established in Martha's name at the Logan Pass Visitor Center included information about her life, her contributions to wilderness advocacy, and the importance of maintaining both respect for wildlife and awareness of natural hazards. The memorial served as an educational tool for park visitors, while honoring the memory of someone who had found profound meaning in wilderness experiences. The family photographs that Martha had carried during her final hike, including the images of Robert that had prompted her annual pilgrimages to Glacier, were returned to her children and became cherished reminders of their parents' shared love for wild places. The photographs captured moments of joy and adventure that represented the positive aspects of wilderness exploration that had motivated Martha throughout her adult life. The detailed forensic analysis of the attack site provided wildlife biologists with unprecedented data about the specific behaviors exhibited by a large predator during a fatal encounter with a human. This information contributed to improved understanding of the warning signs that might indicate dangerous situations and the most effective responses for people who found themselves in similar circumstances. The equipment that Martha had carried during her final hike, including her bear spray, emergency supplies, and navigation equipment, was examined by safety experts to evaluate the effectiveness of various protective measures. The analysis confirmed that her preparations had been exemplary by current standards, but also identified potential improvements in equipment design and deployment strategies. The weather data from July 6, 2024 was incorporated into ongoing climate research, examining how changing environmental conditions might affect wildlife behavior patterns and human-wildlife interaction frequency. The early snowmelt that had concentrated bear activity along lower elevation corridors represented a pattern that was becoming more common due to warming temperatures. The tourism industry in the Glacier National Park region gradually recovered from the negative publicity associated with Martha's death, though the incident created lasting changes in how wilderness risks were discussed and managed. Outfitters and guides developed enhanced safety protocols and educational programs that acknowledge the reality of natural hazards while promoting responsible wilderness recreation. The legal precedents established by the limited litigation following Martha's death contributed to ongoing discussions about the appropriate balance between individual responsibility and institutional liability in wilderness recreation. The case became part of the legal framework governing outdoor recreation in areas with significant natural hazards. The emergency response procedures tested during the search for Martha and the subsequent investigation were refined based on lessons learned during the incident. Improvements included enhanced communication systems, better coordination between agencies, and more efficient deployment of specialized equipment for wilderness emergency operations. The psychological research conducted with wilderness enthusiasts following Martha's death provided valuable insights into how people process and respond to awareness of extreme risks associated with activities they find deeply meaningful. The research contributed to improved understanding of risk perception and decision-making in recreational contexts. The seasonal closure patterns for wilderness areas were modified based on improved understanding of wildlife behavior patterns and the environmental factors that contributed to increased conflict potential. The changes included more dynamic closure systems that could respond rapidly to developing situations rather than relying solely on predetermined seasonal restrictions. The educational materials developed for wilderness safety training were enhanced to include specific case study analysis of Martha's encounter, providing concrete examples of how well-prepared, experienced individuals could still face situations that exceeded their ability to respond effectively. The materials emphasized the importance of group travel and communication systems for reducing risk. The ongoing monitoring of the bear population in the area where Martha died provided wildlife managers with detailed information about how the removal of one dominant individual affected local population dynamics and territory use patterns. The data contributed to broader understanding of grizzly bear social ecology and management strategies. The anniversary of Martha's death became an annual opportunity for wilderness safety education and awareness activities throughout the region. Educational events, memorial hikes, and safety workshops were organized to honor her memory, while promoting improved understanding of wilderness risks and appropriate precautionary measures. The detailed documentation of Martha's case became part of the international scientific literature on human-wildlife conflicts, contributing to research efforts in other regions where large carnivores and human recreational activities intersected. The case provided data that was relevant to bear management efforts throughout North America and other continents. The technology used for wildlife monitoring in the area was upgraded following Martha's death, including enhanced camera systems, improved radio telemetry equipment, and experimental GPS tracking devices for individual animals. The technological improvements were designed to provide earlier warning of potentially dangerous situations. The volunteer wilderness education programs that Martha had supported during her lifetime were expanded in her memory, with increased funding and enhanced curricula that reflected lessons learned from her death. The programs trained thousands of wilderness enthusiasts in safety procedures and wildlife awareness techniques. The scientific publication of the investigation results provided the academic and management communities with detailed analysis of a rare but significant incident type. The peer-reviewed articles contributed to evidence-based approaches for wilderness management and safety education that could be implemented in similar environments worldwide. The long-term ecological monitoring of the area where Martha died provided baseline data for understanding how human-wildlife conflicts might change over time in response to factors such as climate change, visitor use patterns, and wildlife population dynamics. The monitoring would continue for decades, providing valuable longitudinal data sets. The personal effects that Martha had carried during her final hike, including her hiking journals from previous years, provided insights into her decision-making processes and risk assessment approaches that contributed to improved understanding of how experienced wilderness users evaluate and manage hazards. The information was valuable for developing educational materials for similar demographics. 5 years after Martha Phillips' death, the comprehensive changes implemented in response to her tragedy had demonstrably improved safety conditions for wilderness visitors throughout the region. Statistical analysis showed reduced rates of human-wildlife conflicts and improved emergency response times for incidents that did occur. The memorial fund established in Martha's name had grown into a significant source of support for wilderness safety research and education, funding dozens of projects that contributed to improved understanding of human-wildlife interactions and more effective risk management strategies. The fund's activities extended throughout North America and internationally. The annual safety report published by Glacier National Park included detailed analysis of trends in wildlife incidents, visitor safety education effectiveness, and emergency response capabilities. Martha's case remained a reference point for evaluating the success of various safety improvements and identifying areas where additional enhancements might be beneficial. The wilderness therapy programs that incorporated Martha's story into their curricula reported success in helping participants develop appropriate respect for natural hazards while maintaining enthusiasm for outdoor activities. The balanced approach emphasized both the profound rewards and serious responsibilities associated with wilderness exploration. The research initiated in response to Martha's death had generated dozens of scientific publications, conference presentations, and management recommendations that influenced wildlife and recreation policies throughout North America. The scientific legacy of her death contributed to improved safety for countless future wilderness users. The community of wilderness enthusiasts who had known Martha personally continued to gather annually for memorial hikes and safety education events. These gatherings provided opportunities for sharing knowledge, processing grief, and maintaining connections to the wilderness values that Martha had embodied throughout her life. The interpretive programs at Glacier National Park incorporated Martha's story into broader educational efforts about living with large carnivores and the importance of maintaining healthy ecosystems that supported apex predators. The programs helped visitors understand their role in conservation efforts while emphasizing personal safety considerations. The technical climbing and hiking equipment industry had developed several safety innovations that were inspired by analysis of Martha's incident and similar cases. The improvements included enhanced bear deterrent systems, improved emergency communication devices, and more effective first aid equipment for wilderness use. The psychological support services for families affected by wilderness tragedies were expanded and improved, based on experiences working with Martha's family and others who had faced similar losses. The services addressed the complex emotional needs of people who had lost loved ones, while pursuing activities that were central to their identities and values. 10 years after Martha Phillips died on the Highline Trail, her legacy lived on through the countless lives that had been touched by the safety improvements, research advances, and educational programs that grew from the careful examination of her final day in the wilderness she loved. Her death had transformed from personal tragedy into lasting contributions to the safety and understanding of all who sought connection with the wild places that defined the American wilderness experience. The mountains remained unchanged, their ancient rhythms continuing as they had for millennia, indifferent to human joy or sorrow, but somehow made more meaningful by the stories of those who had found their deepest truths among the peaks and valleys of Glacier National Park. Martha Phillips had found her own truth in those mountains, and though it had ultimately cost her life, her story became part of the eternal dialogue between humans and wilderness that defined the ongoing American adventure in the land of grizzly bears and endless sky. The next stories. Polar Bear Storm's Arctic Research Station, December 22, 2024. The Arctic wind howled across the tundra with a ferocity that seemed almost alive, carrying with it the crystalline bite of December air that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. At 3:47 a.m. Alaska Standard Time, the Barrow Arctic Research Station stood like a defiant beacon against the endless expanse of white, its reinforced steel walls and triple-pane windows glowing warmly in the perpetual darkness of the polar winter. The facility, operated jointly by the National Science Foundation and the University of Alaska Fairbanks, had been humanity's northernmost outpost of scientific inquiry for over 2 decades, weathering countless storms and the harsh realities of life at 71 degrees north latitude. Dr. Karen Marie Olson, 43 years old and a veteran climatologist with 18 years of Arctic research experience, sat hunched over her workstation in Laboratory Module C, her weathered hands typing methodical notes into her laptop. Born in Anchorage to Norwegian immigrant parents who had come to Alaska in the 1960s seeking opportunity in the oil fields, Karen had grown up with stories of the old country's harsh winters, but nothing had prepared her for the raw, unforgiving nature of the true Arctic. Her father, Niels Olsen, had been a petroleum engineer who worked the North Slope for Exxon, and her mother, Astrid, had taught elementary school in Anchorage until her death from cancer when Karen was 16. The loss had driven Karen to seek solace in the natural world, leading her to pursue advanced degrees in atmospheric science and glaciology at the University of Washington, where she had met her husband David, a marine biologist who now worked at the Seattle Aquarium. Karen's current research focused on the alarming rate of sea ice decline in the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas, a phenomenon that was having cascading effects on Arctic wildlife populations, particularly the polar bears that had become increasingly desperate as their hunting grounds literally melted beneath their massive paws. Her data, collected over the past 6 months at the station, painted a grim picture of environmental collapse that would reshape the Arctic ecosystem within her lifetime. The irony was not lost on her that her work, documenting the disappearance of polar bear habitat, had brought her into direct conflict with one of the magnificent predators she was trying to save. The research station itself was a marvel of Arctic engineering, consisting of 7 interconnected modules built to withstand temperatures as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit, -60 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The main facility housed the Central Operations Center, communications array, and primary living quarters, while specialized laboratory modules extended outward like spokes on a wheel, connected by heated corridors that allowed researchers to move between sections without exposure to the lethal cold outside. Each module was constructed with reinforced steel frameworks, insulated with multiple layers of specialized foam, and clad in weather-resistant aluminum siding designed to deflect the constant assault of wind-driven ice crystals. Module C, where Karen worked through the long Arctic night, contained the station's most sophisticated atmospheric monitoring equipment, including a mass spectrometer for analyzing ice core samples, a gas chromatograph for measuring trace atmospheric gases, and a bank of computers running climate modeling software that required constant monitoring. The laboratory's windows, triple-paned and filled with argon gas for insulation, offered a view across the frozen Chukchi Sea, where pressure ridges of ice created an otherworldly landscape of jagged white formations that stretched to the horizon. Outside, the temperature had dropped to -38 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds gusting up to 45 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The polar night, which had begun in mid-November and would not end until late January, cast the landscape in an ethereal blue twilight illuminated only by the aurora borealis and the station's powerful exterior floodlights, which created pools of harsh white illumination that extended perhaps 50 yards into the swirling snow before being swallowed by the darkness. Dr. James Robert Harrison, the station's 47-year-old director, made his way through the central corridor toward the operations center, his heavy Arctic boots echoing on the metal flooring. A former Navy meteorologist who had served 3 tours in Antarctica before transitioning to civilian research, James possessed the kind of steady, unflappable demeanor that made him ideal for managing the complex logistics of Arctic operations. Born in Portland, Maine, to a family of commercial fishermen, he had grown up understanding the sea's moods and the critical importance of reading weather patterns, skills that had served him well during his military career and now in his role overseeing one of the most remote research facilities on Earth. James had been monitoring the weather systems, moving in from the Siberian coast, massive low-pressure formations that were bringing additional wind and snow to an already brutal Arctic winter. The station's meteorological equipment indicated that the current storm system would intensify over the next 48 hours, potentially bringing winds in excess of 70 miles per hour and temperatures that could drop below -50 degrees. While the facility was designed to handle such conditions, James knew from experience that extreme weather could create unexpected problems, from frozen fuel lines to communication equipment failures that could leave the station isolated for days or even weeks. The operations center, located in the heart of the main module, served as the station's nerve center, containing banks of monitoring equipment that tracked everything from exterior temperature and wind speed to the internal systems that kept the facility habitable. Rows of LED displays showed real-time data from sensors positioned throughout the complex, while a large central screen displayed satellite imagery of the surrounding region, updated every 15 minutes via the station's sophisticated communications array. The room maintained a constant temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit, a stark contrast to the lethal cold outside, and hummed with the quiet efficiency of computers and ventilation systems working around the clock to sustain human life in one of Earth's most inhospitable environments. Maria Elena Vasquez, 29 years old and the station's lead communications technician, sat at her workstation monitoring radio traffic from Barrow and Anchorage, her dark eyes focused on the scrolling text of weather updates and supply logistics. Born in El Paso, Texas, to Mexican immigrant parents who had worked their way up from farm laborers to middle-class stability, Maria had excelled in mathematics and electronics at the University of Texas, earning degrees in electrical engineering and telecommunications before being recruited by the National Science Foundation for Arctic operations. Her fluency in Spanish had proven valuable during joint research projects with Mexican and Argentinian scientists studying climate change impacts, and her technical expertise with satellite communications had made her indispensable to the station's operations. Maria's younger brother, Carlos, was serving with the army in Afghanistan, and she worried constantly about his safety, checking email obsessively for messages from home. Her parents, Eduardo and Carmen, ran a small restaurant in El Paso and had initially been dismayed by their daughter's decision to work in such a remote and dangerous location, but they had come to understand her passion for the work and took pride in her accomplishments, though they prayed daily for her safe return. Maria sent them photographs of the Arctic landscape and detailed descriptions of the research being conducted, helping them understand the critical importance of the climate data being collected at the station. The station's crew quarters, located in Module A, housed 8 researchers and support staff in individual rooms that were spartanly furnished but comfortable, each containing a single bed, desk, dresser, and small bookshelf. The rooms were designed for privacy and quiet study, with sound-dampening materials that helped muffle the constant noise of the facility's life support systems. Common areas included a kitchen and dining room where the crew shared meals, a recreation room with exercise equipment and a satellite television system, and a small library stocked with technical journals, novels, and games to help pass the long winter nights. Dr. Robert William Chen, 35 years old and a marine biologist specializing in Arctic marine ecosystems, occupied Room 4, where he had covered the walls with photographs of polar bears, seals, and Arctic foxes taken during his field research expeditions. Born in San Francisco to Taiwanese immigrant parents who had established a successful import business, Robert had grown up fascinated by marine life, spending summers at the Monterey Bay Aquarium and pursuing marine biology at UC Santa Cruz. His current research involved studying the impact of declining sea ice on Arctic marine food chains. work that required him to venture onto the sea ice in specially designed vehicles to collect water and ice samples for analysis. Robert's parents, David and Lily Chen, had initially hoped he would join the family business, but they had eventually supported his academic pursuits, taking pride in his doctoral dissertation on Arctic marine ecosystems and his subsequent work with the National Science Foundation. His younger sister, Jennifer, was a pediatric nurse in Los Angeles, and the two siblings maintained a close relationship despite the geographical distance, communicating regularly via email and satellite phone calls that sometimes suffered from interference due to solar activity affecting satellite communications in the Arctic. The station's power systems, located in a separate utility module connected to the main complex by an insulated conduit, consisted of 3 diesel generators capable of producing enough electricity to power a small town, along with backup battery systems and solar panels that provided limited additional power during the brief Arctic summer when the sun never set. The generators consumed approximately 500 gallons of diesel fuel per day during the winter months, requiring regular supply flights from Anchorage that were often delayed or cancelled due to severe weather conditions. Emergency protocols required the station to maintain a minimum of 90 days' worth of fuel at all times, along with sufficient food and medical supplies to sustain the crew through an extended period of isolation. Dr. Jennifer Rose Kowalski, 31 years old and the station's physician and medical researcher, was conducting her evening rounds through the facility, checking on crew members and monitoring their health in the harsh Arctic environment. Born in Minneapolis to Polish-American parents who had both worked as nurses at the University of Minnesota Hospital, Jennifer had grown up around medicine and had always known she wanted to pursue a career in healthcare. After completing her medical degree at Johns Hopkins and a residency in emergency medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital, she had been drawn to Arctic medicine by the unique challenges presented by extreme environments and the opportunity to study the physiological adaptations required for human survival in polar conditions. Jennifer's research focused on the psychological and physiological impacts of prolonged isolation and extreme cold on human performance and health, work that had applications not only for Arctic operations, but also for space exploration missions that would require humans to survive in isolated, hostile environments for extended periods. She maintained detailed medical records on each crew member, monitoring everything from vitamin D levels to cardiovascular fitness, and had published several papers on the increased caloric requirements and metabolic changes observed in personnel working in Arctic conditions. Her personal life had been put on hold by her commitment to Arctic research, a sacrifice that weighed heavily on her as she watched friends from medical school marry and start families, while she spent months at a time in one of the most remote locations on Earth. Her parents, Stanley and Margaret Kowalski, worried constantly about her safety and had begged her to accept a position at a hospital in Minneapolis, but they understood her dedication to her research and the important contributions she was making to understanding human adaptation to extreme environments. The station's food storage areas, located in Module B, contained enough provisions to sustain the 8-person crew for 4 months, including freeze-dried meals, canned goods, frozen meats, and fresh vegetables flown in weekly during good weather. The kitchen facilities were designed for efficiency and safety, with industrial-grade equipment capable of preparing meals for the crew while minimizing waste and conserving water, which was produced by melting ice and snow in specialized heating units. Meal preparation was a communal responsibility, with crew members taking turns cooking and cleaning, an arrangement that helped maintain morale and provided opportunities for social interaction during the long winter months. Thomas Andrew Sullivan, 26 years old and the station's youngest crew member, served as the facility's maintenance engineer and general technician, responsible for keeping the complex array of systems functioning in the harsh Arctic environment. Born in Billings, Montana, to a family of ranchers who had worked the same land for 3 generations, Tom had grown up with a natural mechanical aptitude, fixing farm equipment and learning to work with his hands from his father, Michael Sullivan, and grandfather, Patrick Sullivan. After studying mechanical engineering at Montana State University, he had been recruited by the National Science Foundation based on his expertise with diesel engines and heating systems, skills that were critical for Arctic operations. Tom's girlfriend, Sarah Mitchell, was a teacher in Billings, who had initially supported his decision to work in the Arctic, but was growing increasingly concerned about the long separations and the dangers inherent in his work. They had been dating for 3 years and had discussed marriage, but the demands of his career had created strain in their relationship, particularly during the long winter deployments when communication was limited and uncertainty about his safety created anxiety for both of them. Tom carried photographs of Sarah in his wallet and called her every evening when satellite communications permitted, sharing details of his work and trying to maintain their connection across the vast distances that separated them. The station's waste management systems were a marvel of Arctic engineering, designed to handle all forms of human waste and scientific refuse, while minimizing environmental impact and complying with strict international protocols governing activities in the Arctic. Solid waste was incinerated in a high-temperature furnace that reduced most materials to ash, while organic waste was treated in a biological processor that broke down food scraps and human waste into harmless components that could be safely disposed of during the spring thaw. Hazardous materials, including chemical reagents and electronic components, were carefully packaged and shipped back to Anchorage for proper disposal at certified facilities. Dr. Michelle Ann Rodriguez, 28 years old and a geologist specializing in Arctic permafrost studies, spent her days analyzing soil samples and ice cores in the station's geological laboratory, documenting the alarming rate at which the permanently frozen ground was thawing due to rising temperatures. Born in Phoenix, Arizona, to Mexican-American parents who had worked their way up from construction laborers to successful contractors, Michelle had developed an early interest in earth sciences after witnessing the environmental impacts of rapid urban development in the desert Southwest. Her doctoral dissertation at Arizona State University had focused on the role of permafrost in global carbon cycles, research that had led to her current position studying the massive carbon releases occurring as Arctic permafrost melted. Michelle's work had profound implications for understanding global climate change, as the Arctic permafrost contained vast quantities of carbon that were being released into the atmosphere as methane and carbon dioxide as temperatures rose. Her data indicated that the permafrost beneath the research station was thawing at an unprecedented rate, potentially destabilizing the foundation of the facility and releasing enormous quantities of greenhouse gases that would accelerate global warming. She had been corresponding with researchers at other Arctic stations and had documented similar patterns throughout the circumpolar North, painting a picture of environmental change that was occurring far more rapidly than most climate models had predicted. Her personal life had been complicated by her commitment to Arctic research, as her boyfriend of 2 years, David Martinez, a lawyer in Phoenix, had grown tired of the long separations and had recently ended their relationship via email, a painful reminder of the personal costs of her scientific career. Her parents, Carlos and Isabella Rodriguez, supported her work but worried about her safety and her future, hoping she would eventually return to Arizona and settle down with a family, expectations that created additional pressure as Michelle struggled to balance her professional ambitions with her personal desires. Erik Gunnar Lindqvist, 39 years old and a mechanical engineer from Tromsø, Norway, had joined the research team on a 6-month exchange program sponsored by the Arctic Council, bringing expertise in cold weather engineering that was invaluable for maintaining the station's complex systems. Born above the Arctic Circle to a family of reindeer herders who had gradually transitioned to modern occupations while maintaining their connection to traditional Sami culture, Erik possessed an intuitive understanding of Arctic conditions that complemented his formal engineering training at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Erik's knowledge of cold weather operations had proven invaluable during equipment failures and extreme weather events, as he understood from childhood experience how materials behaved at extreme temperatures and how to improvise solutions using limited resources. His great-grandfather had been a traditional reindeer herder who had taught Erik to read weather patterns and animal behavior, skills that he had adapted to modern scientific applications. Erik maintained correspondence with researchers at the University of Svalbard and other Arctic institutions, sharing data and collaborating on projects studying the impacts of climate change on Arctic communities and ecosystems. His wife, Ingrid, and 2 children, Lars and Astrid, remained in Tromsø, where Ingrid worked as a nurse at the University Hospital of North Norway, while caring for their family and maintaining their household during Erik's extended absences. The family had made significant sacrifices to support Erik's international research career, and he felt the weight of responsibility to make meaningful contributions to Arctic science that would justify the time away from his loved ones. He called home every evening when possible, reading bedtime stories to his children via satellite video connection and helping them with homework, despite the time zone differences and technical challenges of Arctic communications. The station's vehicle bay, located in a heated garage attached to Module E, housed 3 specially designed Arctic vehicles, including 2 tracked snow machines capable of operating in temperatures as low as -60 degrees Fahrenheit, and a larger enclosed vehicle equipped with life support systems for extended operations on the sea ice. The vehicles were maintained in constant readiness for emergency evacuations or rescue operations, with pre-positioned survival gear including emergency shelters, additional fuel, medical supplies, and communications equipment that could sustain a small group for up to 72 hours in extreme conditions. Security protocols at the station were designed primarily to protect against environmental hazards rather than human threats, but included procedures for dealing with wildlife encounters, particularly polar bears, that were known to investigate human settlements in search of food. The facility's exterior was equipped with motion-activated floodlights and a perimeter alarm system that detected large, moving objects within 200 yards of the buildings. Additionally, crew members were trained in the use of flare guns and bear spray for wildlife deterrence, and several high-powered rifles were secured in the operations center for use in extreme situations where human life was threatened by aggressive wildlife. The station's meteorological equipment included a sophisticated weather station mounted on a 60-foot tower that collected real-time data on temperature, humidity, wind speed and direction, barometric pressure, and precipitation. This information was transmitted via satellite to weather services in Anchorage and shared with international Arctic research networks, contributing to global climate monitoring efforts and weather prediction models. The data was also used to make critical decisions about flight operations, as the station's emergency landing strip required constant maintenance and could only be used during specific weather conditions. Dr. Angela Marie Foster, 33 years old, and an atmospheric physicist studying Arctic air masses and their role in global weather patterns, had been monitoring concerning changes in atmospheric circulation that were affecting weather systems across North America and Europe. Born in Denver, Colorado, To parents who were both college professors at the University of Colorado, Angela had grown up in an academic environment that encouraged scientific inquiry and critical thinking. Her father, Dr. Michael Foster, was a professor of physics, while her mother, Dr. Patricia Foster, taught environmental science, and both had encouraged Angela's interest in atmospheric research. Angela's current work involved launching weather balloons twice daily to collect atmospheric data at altitudes up to 100,000 feet, information that was critical for understanding how Arctic warming was affecting global weather patterns. Her data had documented significant changes in the polar jet stream, the high-altitude air current that separates Arctic air masses from warmer southern air. Changes that were contributing to more extreme weather events at lower latitudes, including severe winter storms, summer heat waves, and prolonged droughts. Her personal relationships had suffered due to her dedication to her research and the extended periods of isolation required by Arctic fieldwork. A recent engagement to Dr. Kevin Thompson, a colleague at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, had ended when Kevin accepted a position at MIT, and Angela chose to continue her Arctic research rather than relocate to Boston. The decision had been painful, but reflected her commitment to work that she believed was critical for understanding and potentially mitigating the impacts of global climate change. On the evening of December 21st, 2024, the winter solstice, the research team had gathered in the common area to mark the darkest day of the year, a tradition that helped maintain morale during the psychologically challenging polar night. They had shared a special dinner prepared by Tom Sullivan, who had demonstrated surprising culinary skills learned from his grandmother and had spent the evening playing board games and sharing stories from their respective homelands. The celebration had continued until nearly midnight, with team members taking turns reading from their favorite books and sharing music from their personal collections. Dr. Karen Olson had retired to her laboratory around 1 a.m. to continue processing atmospheric data from the previous day's weather balloon launch, work that required careful analysis of temperature and humidity profiles that revealed the structure of Arctic air masses. She had been particularly interested in data showing unusual warming at high altitudes, a phenomenon that could indicate significant changes in atmospheric circulation patterns. Her coffee had grown cold as she worked, and she had wrapped herself in a thick wool sweater to ward off the chill that seemed to penetrate even the well-heated laboratory spaces during the most extreme cold snaps. The storm system that had been approaching from the west had intensified throughout the evening, bringing winds that howled around the station's structures with increasing ferocity and driving snow that reduced visibility to near zero. The facility's automatic weather station recorded gusts exceeding 50 miles per hour by 2 a.m., with the temperature dropping to -41 degrees Fahrenheit, conditions that would prove fatal to any human exposed to the elements for more than a few minutes. The storm had also increased the activity of the aurora borealis, creating spectacular displays of green and purple light that danced across the Arctic sky, visible through the laboratory windows when blowing snow did not obscure the view. At 3:12 a.m., the station's perimeter motion sensors detected a large object moving slowly across the ice approximately 150 yards from the main facility, triggering automated floodlights that illuminated a massive polar bear methodically investigating the area around the station's waste disposal unit. The bear, a mature male weighing approximately 1,200 pounds and standing over 10 feet tall when reared on its hind legs, had been drawn by the scents emanating from the station's refuse, which, despite careful handling protocols, still carried traces of human food and organic waste that were irresistible to a hungry predator. Polar bears, the largest terrestrial carnivores on Earth, possess an extraordinary sense of smell that allows them to detect seals beneath several feet of snow and ice from distances exceeding a mile. This same ability makes them capable of detecting human food sources from vast distances, and the increasing scarcity of their traditional prey due to climate change to declining sea ice had made many bears more aggressive and desperate in their search for alternative food sources. Adult males like the bear, now investigating the research station, were particularly dangerous, as they possessed the strength to easily break through barriers that would stop most other wildlife and had no natural fear of humans. The bear's presence triggered automatic alerts in the station's operations center, where emergency protocols called for immediate notification of all personnel and activation of additional security measures. However, the storm's intensity had created interference with some of the facility's electronic systems, and several crew members were wearing noise-cancelling headphones or were in areas of the station where the alert signals were not clearly audible. Dr. Olson, absorbed in her data analysis and working alone in Laboratory Module C, did not immediately notice the flashing warning lights on her computer terminal, which were partially obscured by the windows she had opened for her atmospheric modeling software. The polar bear, designated Bear 47 in wildlife tracking databases maintained by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, had been tagged and monitored by researchers for over 3 years as part of ongoing studies of polar bear population dynamics and habitat use. Born in 2018 on the sea ice near Wrangel Island, he had been orphaned at 18 months when his mother had been killed by a larger male, forcing him to survive independently at an unusually young age. This early trauma had made him more aggressive and opportunistic than typical bears, and had led to several previous encounters with human settlements, including an incident in 2023 where he had damaged equipment at an oil exploration camp near Deadhorse. Wildlife biologists who had studied Bear 47 noted his unusual persistence when investigating potential food sources and his apparent lack of fear of human structures and technology. His tracking collar, equipped with GPS and satellite communication capabilities, had documented extensive travels across the Chukchi Sea ice, covering over 3,000 miles during the previous year as he searched for increasingly scarce seal populations. Recent data from his collar showed that he had not successfully hunted seals for over 2 weeks, a prolonged fast that would have left him desperately hungry and willing to take extraordinary risks to find food. The bear's approach to the research station followed a pattern typical of polar bear investigation behavior, beginning with careful assessment from a distance, followed by gradual approach while testing air currents to gather scent information, and culminating in direct physical investigation of structures and potential food sources. Security camera footage later revealed that Bear 47 had been in the vicinity of the station for several hours before triggering the motion sensors, moving in wide circles downwind of the facility while gathering information about the human presence and assessing potential threats and opportunities. At 3:33 a.m., the bear's investigation brought him into direct contact with the station's main power cables, which ran above ground between the generator building and the primary facility in heavily insulated conduits designed to prevent freezing. The bear's powerful claws, evolved for gripping ice and tearing through seal breathing holes, easily penetrated the protective covering and severed 2 of the 3 main power lines, instantly reducing the station's electrical capacity by 60% and triggering emergency lighting systems throughout the facility. The power failure immediately activated backup generators and battery systems, but the sudden reduction in electrical capacity caused several of the station's heating units to shut down automatically to prevent system overloads. Within minutes, the temperature in outlying modules began to drop noticeably, and the facility's automated systems began routing available power to critical areas, including the operations center and crew quarters. Laboratory Module C, where Dr. Olson was working, was classified as a secondary priority area and received reduced heating as the system struggled to maintain life-supporting temperatures throughout the complex. The partial power loss also affected the station's communication systems, reducing the effectiveness of both internal communication networks and external satellite links that connected the facility to the outside world. Emergency protocols called for immediate contact with Anchorage and Barrow to report the situation and request assistance, but the combination of storm interference and reduced power made reliable communication extremely difficult. Maria Vasquez, monitoring the communications center, managed to transmit a brief status report indicating technical difficulties, but was unable to provide detailed information about the nature of the emergency before losing the satellite connection entirely. Bear 47's destruction of the power cables had been inadvertent, a byproduct of his investigation of the unusual structures rather than a deliberate attack, but the damage created the perfect conditions for a more serious incident. The power loss disabled several of the station's security systems, including motion sensors and automated warning systems, while the reduced heating capacity forced crew members to focus on maintaining warmth and system functionality rather than monitoring for external threats. The bear, meanwhile, had discovered that his interaction with human structures had produced interesting results, including unusual sounds and changes in the patterns of light emanating from the buildings. Dr. James Harrison, awakened by the emergency alerts triggered by the power loss, quickly assessed the situation from the operations center and began coordinating the station's response to what initially appeared to be a standard equipment failure caused by extreme weather conditions. Emergency protocols for power system failures were well established and had been practiced regularly, involving systematic shutdown of non-essential systems, activation of backup power sources, and assessment of repair requirements. Harrison's military experience and years of Arctic operations had prepared him for such emergencies, but he had not yet recognized that the facility was under investigation by one of the Arctic's most dangerous predators. The station's emergency lighting cast eerie shadows throughout the facility as crew members emerged from their quarters to assist with damage assessment and system restoration. Tom Sullivan immediately began checking the generator systems and backup power sources, while Eric Lindqvist prepared to venture outside to examine the damaged power cables once the storm subsided sufficiently to allow safe exterior operations. The crew's training and experience in Arctic emergencies served them well as they methodically worked through established procedures, but their focus on technical problems prevented them from recognizing the growing wildlife threat just outside their walls. Bear 47's investigation of the research station had intensified following his inadvertent success with the power cables, and he began more aggressive exploration of the facility's exterior structures. Security cameras that remained operational recorded him standing on his hind legs to examine windows and ventilation systems, his massive paws leaving deep scratches in the aluminum siding as he tested the strength of various surfaces. His behavior exhibited the problem-solving intelligence that made polar bears such effective hunters, as he systematically tested different approaches to gaining access to the interior spaces that clearly contained the sources of the fascinating scents that had drawn his attention. The storm reached its peak intensity around 4:15 a.m., with sustained winds exceeding 60 miles per hour and gusts approaching 80 miles per hour. Conditions that made any exterior operations extremely hazardous and provided additional cover for the bear's activities. The howling wind masked the sounds of his investigation, including the scraping of claws against metal siding and the testing of various exterior fixtures and fittings. Snow accumulation driven by the powerful winds began to create drifts against the station's structures, potentially providing the bear with elevated platforms that could allow access to parts of the building that were normally beyond reach. Dr. Karen Olson, still focused on her atmospheric data analysis despite the emergency lighting and reduced heating in her laboratory, represented an isolated and vulnerable target within the facility's security perimeter. Laboratory Module C, connected to the main facility by a heated corridor approximately 40 feet in length, had been designed for scientific work rather than security, with large windows that provided excellent views of the Arctic landscape during daylight hours, but created potential points of vulnerability during the polar night. The module's exterior doors, while substantial, were designed primarily to provide weather protection and insulation, rather than security against determined wildlife intrusions. The laboratory's atmosphere monitoring equipment continued to function on battery power, displaying real-time data from sensors positioned throughout the Arctic region and providing Karen with fascinating insights into the atmospheric dynamics of the severe storm system currently affecting the station. Her scientific training and years of Arctic experience had taught her to find beauty and wonder in even the most extreme weather events, and she was documenting unusual pressure variations and temperature fluctuations that would contribute to better understanding of Arctic storm systems. Her dedication to her research was so complete that she remained largely unaware of the developing emergency outside her laboratory walls. At 4:23 a.m., Bear 47's systematic investigation of the station's exterior brought him to Laboratory Module C, where the combination of interior lighting and residual heat signatures made the structure particularly attractive for closer inspection. The Bear's approach was methodical and intelligent as he tested the strength of exterior fixtures and examined the large windows that provided views into the laboratory space. His keen eyesight, adapted for spotting seals at great distances across ice and snow, easily detected movement within the building, and his predatory instincts were triggered by the sight of a solitary human working alone in what appeared to be a confined space. The laboratory's windows, while designed to withstand extreme weather conditions, including hurricane-force winds and flying debris, had not been engineered to resist the focused attack of a 1,200-pound predator, armed with claws, capable of tearing through thick ice and powerful jaws that could crush seal skulls with ease. The triple-pane design that provided excellent insulation against Arctic cold would prove inadequate against the concentrated force that a desperate and determined polar bear could bring to bear against a relatively small target area. Dr. Olson first became aware of the bear's presence when she noticed movement outside the laboratory windows, initially dismissing it as wind-blown debris or possibly equipment being moved by the storm. Her scientific mindset led her to investigate the phenomenon more closely, and she approached the windows to get a better view of the exterior conditions, inadvertently positioning herself directly in the bear's line of sight. The moment when human and bear made eye contact through the glass would be seared into her memory for the rest of her life, as she found herself face to face with one of nature's most powerful and dangerous predators, separated only by a few inches of glass and the vast evolutionary distance between prey and predator. The bear's reaction to seeing the human was immediate and decisive, as his hunting instincts overrode any caution or uncertainty about the unusual situation. His massive forepaws struck the window with tremendous force, spiderwebbing the outer pane of glass and creating a thunderous impact that reverberated throughout the laboratory module. Dr. Olson's scientific fascination instantly transformed into primal terror as she realized the gravity of her situation. But her years of Arctic training kicked in as she immediately activated the laboratory's emergency alarm system and began backing away from the windows while searching for escape routes and defensive options. The laboratory's emergency alarm sent alerts throughout the station's remaining functional communication systems, but the combination of storm interference and power limitations meant that the signal was not immediately received in all areas of the facility. Tom Sullivan, working in the generator room to restore full power, heard the alarm and immediately recognized it as a wildlife emergency signal, the most serious type of alert in the station's emergency protocols. His training kicked in as he grabbed the emergency rifle stored in the generator room and began making his way toward Laboratory Module C, knowing that response time would be critical in any wildlife encounter. Bear 47's first strike against the laboratory window had been a probing attack, testing the strength of the barrier and assessing the situation. His intelligence and problem-solving abilities, honed by years of Arctic survival, led him to focus his attention on the window frame and mounting hardware, which represented potential weak points in the structure's defenses. His subsequent attacks were more focused and systematic, as he used his claws to tear at the window seals and his massive weight to put pressure on the mounting system that held the windows in place. Dr. Olsen's emergency training had prepared her for various Arctic hazards, including equipment failures, medical emergencies, and even ice breakup scenarios, but nothing had truly prepared her for finding herself trapped in a small space with a massive predator attempting to break through the barriers that separated them. Her scientific mind continued to function even in the face of terror, noting the bear's behavior patterns and attack methods while simultaneously searching for survival strategies and escape routes. The laboratory's interior layout, optimized for scientific work, offered limited options for defense or concealment, with most equipment being too delicate or lightweight to serve as effective barriers against such a powerful attacker. The sound of the bear's attacks on the laboratory windows carried through the station's corridors, despite the howling wind outside, alerting other crew members to the nature of the emergency. Dr. Harrison immediately implemented the facility's wildlife emergency protocols, which called for lockdown of all exterior access points, arming of defensive weapons, and coordination of response efforts. His military training had included situations involving aggressive wildlife, but the extreme Arctic conditions and the station's isolated location made this scenario particularly challenging, as there were no immediate backup resources or evacuation options available. Eric Lindqvist, whose childhood in Lapland had included encounters with aggressive wildlife including wolverines and occasionally bears, understood the lethal seriousness of the situation and began gathering equipment that might be useful in dealing with the threat. His knowledge of Arctic wildlife behavior suggested that the bear would be highly motivated by hunger and desperation, making it unlikely to retreat unless faced with overwhelming force or superior alternatives. The storm conditions that had brought the bear to the station also meant that wildlife management authorities in Barrow or Anchorage could not provide immediate assistance, leaving the research team to handle the crisis with their own resources. At 4:31 a.m., the mounting hardware for the laboratory's largest window finally succumbed to the bear's persistent attacks, and the entire window assembly was torn from its frame with a screaming of tortured metal and shattering glass. Arctic air at -41 degrees Fahrenheit rushed into the laboratory space with explosive force, instantly creating a temperature differential that caused equipment to malfunction and created a fog of condensation that obscured visibility. Dr. Olsen found herself exposed to lethal cold and facing a massive predator that was now actively working to enlarge the opening and gain access to the interior of the laboratory. The bear's entry into the laboratory space was not immediate, as the window opening, while large enough for human access, presented a challenging obstacle for an animal of his size and bulk. His intelligence led him to carefully assess the situation and work systematically to enlarge the opening by tearing away additional framing and interior fixtures. This brief delay provided Dr. Olsen with precious seconds to implement survival strategies including activating additional emergency alerts and positioning herself behind the laboratory's heaviest equipment in an attempt to create barriers between herself and the intruder. The laboratory's scientific equipment, including the mass spectrometer and atmospheric analysis computers, represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in sophisticated technology. But Dr. Olson did not hesitate to use these instruments as defensive barriers and potential weapons as she fought for her life. Her actions during these crucial moments would later be analyzed by survival experts and wildlife management professionals as examples of proper emergency response under extreme conditions. But in the moment, she was operating on pure survival instinct and adrenaline-fueled desperation. Bear 47's successful breach of the laboratory's defenses represented a critical escalation in the encounter, transforming what had been an investigation and testing phase into an active predatory attack. His entry into the human space triggered additional behavioral responses, as the confined environment and proximity to prey activated hunting sequences that had been honed by millions of years of evolutionary development. The bear's massive size, which served him well in the open Arctic environment, became both an advantage and a limitation within the confined space of the laboratory, as he possessed overwhelming physical power but reduced maneuverability. Dr. Olson's first defensive action was to position the laboratory's central workbench between herself and the bear, using the heavy steel and concrete structure as a barrier while searching for additional defensive options. The bench, designed to support heavy scientific equipment and resist vibration during sensitive measurements, proved substantial enough to provide temporary protection. But she knew that it would not long deter a determined attacker of the bear's size and strength. Her emergency training had emphasized the importance of maintaining communication during crisis situations, and she continued to broadcast status reports and pleas for assistance even as she fought for her life. The station's response team, led by Tom Sullivan and including Dr. Harrison and Eric Lindqvist, reached the entrance to Laboratory Module C within 3 minutes of the initial alarm, but found their access blocked by the heavy steel security door that had automatically sealed when the laboratory's environmental systems detected the massive temperature drop caused by the broken window. Emergency protocols required manual override of the security systems, a process that took precious additional minutes as the team worked to gain access to the laboratory while the attack continued inside. The sound of the struggle within the laboratory was clearly audible through the facility's walls and corridors, including the bear's powerful vocalizations, the crash of scientific equipment being knocked over or thrown, and Dr. Olson's shouts for help and defensive actions. The audio recordings from the station's security systems would later provide investigators with a detailed timeline of the attack, but for the crew members fighting to reach their colleague, the sounds represented a horrifying countdown to potential tragedy that drove them to extraordinary efforts to breach their own security systems. Bear 47's behavior within the laboratory space demonstrated the problem-solving intelligence that made polar bears such successful predators, as he systematically worked to overcome the barriers that Dr. Olson had erected while adapting his attack strategies to the confined environment. His massive size allowed him to easily knock over laboratory equipment and furniture, but the space's layout and the presence of various obstacles forced him to modify his approach, creating opportunities for Dr. Olson to reposition herself and maintain distance from her attacker. The laboratory's emergency lighting, operating on battery backup power, cast dramatic shadows as the life and death struggle continued, with Dr. Olson using her knowledge of the space's layout to maximum advantage, while the bear relied on raw power and predatory instinct. Scientific equipment that had been used to study Arctic climate change became improvised weapons and barriers as she fought for survival, including computer monitors thrown at the bear's head and laboratory chemicals sprayed in his direction in desperate attempts to deter his attacks. At 4:37 a.m., Dr. Olsen's defensive strategy suffered a critical setback when the bear's powerful swipe demolished the workbench she had been using as a primary barrier, sending computer equipment crashing to the floor and eliminating her most substantial source of protection. The bear's claws, evolved for gripping ice and tearing through tough seal hide, easily shredded the laboratory furniture and created a shower of debris that further obscured visibility and created additional hazards in the confined space. This breakthrough brought the bear within striking distance of Dr. Olsen, triggering the most critical phase of the encounter. The moment of actual physical contact between predator and prey lasted only seconds, but those seconds contained a lifetime of terror and pain as the bear's massive jaws closed on Dr. Olsen's left shoulder and upper arm, crushing bone and tissue with pressure that exceeded 1,200 pounds per square inch. The bear's teeth, designed to crush seal skulls and tear through thick Arctic ice, penetrated deeply into her shoulder and back, causing massive trauma to muscles, nerves, and blood vessels that would require immediate medical intervention to prevent death from shock and blood loss. Dr. Olsen's screams of pain and terror galvanized the rescue team's efforts to reach her, and Tom Sullivan finally succeeded in overriding the laboratory's security door at 4:39 a.m., just as the bear was attempting to drag his victim toward the broken window opening. The sight that greeted the rescuers was one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, a massive polar bear holding their colleague in his jaws while systematically destroying the laboratory space, with blood spreading across the floor and equipment scattered everywhere in the aftermath of the struggle. Tom Sullivan's military training and hunting experience had prepared him for violent encounters, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of a colleague being mauled by one of nature's most powerful predators in the confined space of a scientific laboratory. His response was immediate and decisive as he raised the emergency rifle and fired the first shot, a .30-06 round that struck the bear in the shoulder and caused him to release Dr. Olsen while roaring in pain and fury. The confined space and the bear's massive size made accurate shooting extremely difficult, but Tom's marksmanship skills proved adequate to the desperate situation. The bear's reaction to being wounded was to become more aggressive rather than retreating, a response typical of polar bears when threatened or injured. His roar of pain and rage reverberated through the laboratory space with such volume and intensity that it was heard throughout the research station, alerting crew members in distant modules to the gravity of the situation. Bear 47's wounded condition made him more dangerous rather than less, as pain and adrenaline combined to trigger maximum aggressive responses while his size and strength remained largely unimpaired. Dr. Olsen's injuries from the bear's initial attack were immediately life-threatening, as the massive trauma to her shoulder and back had severed major blood vessels and caused extensive damage to bone and soft tissue. Her scientific training helped her maintain consciousness despite the shock and blood loss, and she managed to crawl toward the laboratory exit while the bear's attention was focused on the armed rescuers who had entered the space. Her survival during these critical moments depended on immediate medical intervention and the continued efforts of her colleagues to drive off her attacker. Tom Sullivan's second shot struck the bear center mass, a killing shot that would have dropped most animals instantly. But Bear 47's massive size and thick layer of fat and muscle meant that even fatal wounds would not immediately incapacitate him. The bear's charge toward the armed humans created a situation of extreme danger for everyone in the laboratory space, as his 1,200 pounds of muscle and fury could easily kill or severely injure anyone who came within reach of his claws and teeth. The confined space that had initially limited the bear's maneuverability now worked against the humans, as there was little room to retreat or establish safe firing positions. Dr. Harrison and Eric Lindqvist worked together to drag Dr. Olson from the laboratory, while Tom Sullivan continued to engage the wounded bear, their actions requiring split-second coordination and precise timing to avoid additional casualties. The bear's movements, while weakened by his wounds, remained explosively powerful and unpredictable, forcing the rescue team to constantly adjust their strategies while maintaining focus on their primary objectives of saving their colleague and neutralizing the threat to the facility. The third and fourth rifle shots finally brought Bear 47 down, the massive predator collapsing among the wreckage of scientific equipment that had taken years to install and calibrate. Even in death, the bear's size and presence dominated the laboratory space, serving as a stark reminder of the raw power of Arctic wildlife and the thin margin that separated human civilization from the natural world's most dangerous inhabitants. The sudden silence that followed the final gunshots was broken only by the howling of the storm wind through the damaged laboratory and the urgent voices of the rescue team as they worked to save Dr. Olson's life. The immediate aftermath of the attack required coordinated emergency medical response under conditions that would have challenged experienced trauma teams in fully equipped hospitals. Dr. Jennifer Kowalski, the station's physician, arrived at the scene within minutes of the shooting and immediately began implementing emergency trauma protocols using the medical supplies available at the isolated research station. Dr. Olson's injuries included massive tissue damage to her left shoulder and back, multiple bone fractures, severe blood loss, and the beginnings of shock that could prove fatal without immediate intervention. The station's medical facilities, while well-equipped for routine health care and minor emergencies, were not designed for major trauma surgery, forcing Dr. Kowalski to improvise treatment protocols using available resources while fighting to stabilize her patient for eventual evacuation to more capable medical facilities. The storm conditions that had contributed to the bear attack also prevented immediate medical evacuation, meaning that Dr. Olson's survival depended entirely on the emergency medical care that could be provided at the research station using limited resources and equipment. Emergency communications with medical authorities in Anchorage and Barrow were hampered by continuing storm interference and the station's reduced power capacity, but Maria Vasquez managed to establish intermittent contact with emergency dispatchers who began coordinating medical evacuation resources for deployment as soon as weather conditions permitted. The isolation of the Arctic Research Station meant that even with maximum effort from emergency services, medical evacuation could not occur for several hours at minimum, placing enormous pressure on Dr. Kowalski to provide life-saving care with limited resources. Dr. Olson's medical treatment required the combined efforts of the entire research team, as crew members assisted with everything from providing additional lighting to helping move medical equipment and supplies. The station's emergency medical protocols had been designed for situations involving single patients with relatively minor injuries, and the severity of Dr. Olson's wounds strained both the available resources and the expertise of personnel who had received emergency medical training but were not medical professionals. The bear's massive body, sprawled among the ruins of the laboratory equipment, presented both an immediate hazard and a complex disposal problem that would require careful planning and execution. Arctic protocols for dealing with wildlife casualties included requirements for disease testing, documentation for wildlife management authorities, and proper disposal methods that would not attract additional predators to the research station. The bear's size meant that removal would require specialized equipment and coordination with wildlife management officials who were currently unreachable due to the storm conditions. Laboratory Module C had been rendered uninhabitable by the attack, with extensive structural damage including the destroyed window system, damaged heating and electrical systems, and contamination from blood and biological materials that posed health hazards to personnel. The module's scientific equipment, representing several years of research data and hundreds of thousands of dollars in sophisticated instruments, had been largely destroyed or severely damaged during the struggle, creating not only immediate operational problems but also long-term impacts on the station's research mission. The station's security protocols were immediately upgraded following the attack, with crew members establishing armed watches and implementing additional perimeter monitoring procedures to prevent future wildlife encounters. The partial power loss that had contributed to the initial security system failures was addressed as a top priority, with emergency repairs to the damaged electrical systems taking precedence over all other facility operations until full power could be restored and security systems brought back to complete operational status. As dawn approached on December 22, 2024, though dawn would bring only the faintest lightening of the Arctic sky during the polar night, the research team continued their desperate efforts to save Dr. Olson's life while dealing with the complex aftermath of the attack. The storm was beginning to show signs of weakening, offering hope that medical evacuation might become possible within the next few hours. But Dr. Olson's condition remained critical and her survival uncertain, despite the heroic efforts of her colleagues. Dr. Kowalski's emergency medical treatment included aggressive fluid replacement to combat shock, pain management using the station's limited supply of narcotic analgesics, wound cleaning and temporary closure to prevent infection and further blood loss, and splinting of fractured bones to prevent additional tissue damage. Her medical training and emergency room experience proved invaluable as she worked methodically through trauma protocols while adapting to the limitations imposed by the station's remote location and limited medical resources. The psychological impact of the attack affected every member of the research team as they struggled to process the traumatic events while maintaining focus on the immediate emergency response requirements. The sudden transformation of their secure research environment into a scene of violence and life-threatening emergency challenged their psychological resilience and forced them to confront the harsh realities of survival in one of Earth's most dangerous environments. Tom Sullivan's actions during the attack, including his accurate shooting under extreme pressure and his immediate response to the emergency, were credited with saving Dr. Olson's life and preventing additional casualties. His military training and familiarity with firearms had prepared him for violent encounters, but the psychological impact of killing a magnificent Arctic predator in defense of human life created complex emotions that would require professional counseling to fully process. The station's communication efforts finally succeeded in establishing reliable contact with emergency services in Anchorage around 6:15 a.m., allowing detailed coordination of medical evacuation resources and providing Dr. Kowalski with remote consultation from trauma specialists at Alaska Native Medical Center. The improved communications also allowed notification of Dr. Olson's family, including her husband David, in Seattle, who immediately began arrangements to travel to Alaska to be with his wife during her recovery. Weather conditions showed continued improvement throughout the morning hours, with wind speeds dropping below 30 miles per hour and visibility improving to levels that would permit helicopter operations by specialized Arctic medical evacuation units. The Alaska Air National Guard's 210th Rescue Squadron began preparing their HH-60 Pave Hawk helicopter for the dangerous flight to the research station, while medical teams at Alaska Native Medical Center prepared trauma treatment facilities for Dr. Olson's arrival. the medical evacuation helicopter's flight to the Barrow Arctic Research Station represented one of the most challenging rescue operations ever attempted in Arctic conditions, requiring specialized equipment, expert pilots with extensive Arctic experience, and precise coordination between multiple agencies. The flight crew, led by Captain Sarah Mitchell and co-pilot Lieutenant James Rodriguez, had extensive experience in Arctic rescue operations, but acknowledged that the extreme weather conditions and remote location pushed their capabilities to the absolute limits. Dr. Olsen's condition during the morning hours following the attack remained critical but stable, as Dr. Kowalski's emergency medical treatment had successfully controlled the immediate threats to her life while maintaining her vital signs within acceptable parameters. Her consciousness fluctuated due to blood loss and pain medications, but she remained aware enough to provide medical history information and communicate with her rescuers, demonstrating the mental toughness that had made her successful as an Arctic researcher. The bear's body was carefully documented and photographed by the research team to provide evidence for the investigation that would inevitably follow the incident, as federal wildlife management authorities would need comprehensive documentation of the circumstances that had led to the killing of a polar bear, an endangered species protected by multiple international treaties. The bear's radio collar and identification tags confirmed his identity as Bear 47, providing wildlife officials with detailed background information about his movements and previous encounters with human settlements. Laboratory Module C was sealed and declared off-limits to personnel pending professional hazardous materials, cleanup and structural assessment, as the extensive damage and biological contamination created multiple health and safety hazards. The loss of the laboratory's research capabilities represented a significant setback for the station's scientific mission, as several ongoing research projects would need to be suspended or relocated to other facilities, potentially delaying important climate research by months or years. The station's crew quarters became a temporary medical ward as Dr. Kowalski continued monitoring Dr. Olsen's condition while preparing for her evacuation to more capable medical facilities. The common areas were converted into coordination centers for the complex logistical operations required by the medical evacuation, with crew members working around the clock to support the rescue efforts while maintaining essential facility operations under degraded conditions. At 11:42 a.m. Alaska Standard Time, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors became audible over the howling Arctic wind, signaling the arrival of the Alaska Air National Guard medical evacuation team that represented Dr. Olsen's best chance for survival and recovery. The helicopter's approach to the research station's landing area required exceptional skill from the flight crew, as Arctic wind conditions and blowing snow created visibility and control challenges that pushed both equipment and personnel to their operational limits. The medical evacuation team included 2 flight paramedics with extensive trauma training and experience in Arctic operations, Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson and Technical Sergeant Lisa Chen, who immediately took over Dr. Olsen's medical care and began preparing her for transport to the trauma center in Anchorage. Their assessment of her condition confirmed Dr. Kowalski's emergency treatment decisions and indicated that her chances for survival and recovery had been significantly improved by the expert care she had received at the research station. The transfer of Dr. Olsen from the research station to the medical evacuation helicopter required careful coordination and precise timing, as the aircraft could not shut down its engines in the extreme Arctic conditions, and the medical team had to work quickly to minimize exposure to the lethal cold. The research team's efforts to prepare landing area lighting and clear snow from the helicopter pad proved critical to the success of the operation, as visibility conditions remained marginal despite the improvement in weather conditions. Dr. Olsen's departure from the research station at 12:23 p.m. marked the beginning of her long journey toward recovery and the end of the immediate crisis phase of the incident. Her colleagues watched the helicopter disappear into the Arctic haze with mixed emotions, relieved that she was receiving professional medical care, but uncertain about her prognosis and concerned about the long-term impacts of the traumatic incident on everyone involved. The flight to Anchorage required 2.5 hours in challenging weather conditions, with the medical team continuing intensive care treatment throughout the journey while monitoring Dr. Olsen's vital signs and adjusting her treatment protocols based on her response to the medical interventions. The helicopter's sophisticated medical equipment allowed continuous monitoring and treatment that bridged the gap between the emergency care provided at the research station and the comprehensive trauma care that awaited her in Anchorage. Alaska Native Medical Center's trauma team, led by Dr. Michael Harrison, had been preparing for Dr. Olsen's arrival since the early morning hours, reviewing her medical information and consulting with specialists to develop treatment protocols for her complex injuries. The hospital's experience with Arctic trauma cases, including previous wildlife attacks and cold weather injuries, provided valuable expertise for managing the unique challenges presented by her condition. Dr. Olsen's arrival at the trauma center at 3:17 p.m. triggered immediate implementation of advanced trauma protocols, including emergency surgery to repair the extensive damage to her shoulder and back caused by the bear's attack. The surgical team, led by orthopedic surgeon Dr. Patricia Rodriguez and plastic surgeon Dr. James Kim, worked for over 6 hours to repair damaged blood vessels, rebuild shattered bone structures, and restore function to muscles and nerves that had been severely damaged during the mauling. The complexity of Dr. Olsen's injuries required multiple surgical procedures, and the expertise of specialists in orthopedics, plastic surgery, vascular surgery, and neurology, as the bear's attack had caused damage to virtually every type of tissue in her shoulder and upper back. The surgical team's skill and the hospital's advanced medical technology provided her with treatment options that would have been unimaginable even a few years ago, few decades earlier, significantly improving her chances for functional recovery. During the surgical procedures, Dr. Olsen's husband David arrived from Seattle, having caught the first available flight to Anchorage after receiving notification of the attack. His presence provided emotional support during the critical hours when her survival remained uncertain, and his knowledge of her medical history proved valuable to the treatment team as they made decisions about her care and developed long-term treatment plans. The research station crew, meanwhile, continued dealing with the aftermath of the attack, including securing the damaged laboratory module, restoring full power and communication systems, and beginning the complex process of documenting the incident for the multiple investigations that would inevitably follow. Each crew member would need to provide detailed statements about their observations and actions during the emergency, and the station's electronic systems had recorded extensive data about the incident that would be analyzed by investigators. Eric Lindqvist's expertise in cold weather engineering proved invaluable for assessing and repairing the extensive damage to the station's infrastructure caused by both the bear's attack and the emergency response efforts. His work focused on restoring heating and electrical systems to prevent additional equipment damage and ensure the facility remained habitable during the ongoing Arctic winter, when any significant system failure could threaten the lives of everyone at the station. The bear's radio collar and tracking data provided wildlife management officials with detailed information about his movements and behavior in the weeks leading up to the attack, revealing a pattern of increasing desperation and risk-taking behavior as sea ice conditions deteriorated and hunting opportunities became increasingly scarce. This information would prove valuable for understanding the factors that led to the attack and developing strategies to prevent similar incidents in the future. Media coverage of the incident began almost immediately after news of the attack became public, with reporters from around the world seeking information about the dramatic survival story and the broader implications for Arctic research and wildlife management. The story captured international attention due to the combination of human drama, environmental concerns, and the spectacular nature of a polar bear attack at a remote Arctic research facility. Dr. Olsen's survival and the heroic actions of her colleagues became symbols of human resilience and the dedication of Arctic researchers who risk their lives to advance scientific understanding of climate change and its impacts on Arctic ecosystems. The incident also highlighted the increasing conflicts between humans and wildlife as environmental changes forced Arctic animals to adapt their behavior and seek new sources of food and habitat. The investigation into the incident involved multiple agencies, including the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Science Foundation, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and occupational safety officials, each focused on different aspects of the case and seeking to understand how such an incident could occur despite established safety protocols and security measures. Wildlife management officials were particularly interested in understanding Bear 47's behavior and the factors that had led him to attempt such an aggressive attack on a human facility, as this type of behavior was relatively rare among polar bears and represented a concerning escalation in human-wildlife conflicts in the Arctic region. The bear's tracking data and the detailed documentation of his attack provided valuable insights into polar bear behavior under extreme environmental stress. The station's security protocols came under intense scrutiny as investigators sought to determine whether the incident could have been prevented through different procedures or equipment modifications. The review process included examination of everything from perimeter monitoring systems to wildlife deterrent methods and emergency response procedures, with the goal of preventing similar incidents at Arctic research facilities worldwide. Dr. Olsen's initial surgery was deemed successful by the medical team, though her recovery would require months of additional treatment, including multiple follow-up surgeries, extensive physical therapy, and psychological counseling to address the trauma of the attack. Her injuries had caused permanent damage that would likely affect her mobility and strength for the rest of her life, but the medical team was optimistic about her prospects for substantial recovery of function and return to an active lifestyle. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond Dr. Olsen to include every member of the research team, each of whom would require professional counseling to process the traumatic experience and develop coping strategies for continuing their work in Arctic environments. The National Science Foundation immediately implemented expanded psychological support services for Arctic research personnel and began reviewing mental health protocols for remote research operations. The financial impact of the incident exceeded $1 million, including costs for medical evacuation and treatment, facility repairs and equipment replacement, investigation expenses, legal settlements, and increased security measures at Arctic research facilities. These costs highlighted the economic risks associated with Arctic research operations and led to discussions about improved insurance coverage and risk management strategies for remote scientific facilities. Laboratory Module C's reconstruction required specialized Arctic construction techniques and equipment, with work beginning in the spring of 2025, when weather conditions permitted the transportation of materials and personnel to the remote location. The new facility incorporated enhanced security features, including reinforced windows, improved perimeter monitoring systems, and emergency response capabilities designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. The incident's impact on Arctic research extended beyond the immediate facility damage and personnel trauma to include broader questions about the sustainability of human research activities in regions where climate change was increasing wildlife-human conflicts. Research programs throughout the Arctic region implemented enhanced safety protocols and wildlife management procedures based on lessons learned from the Barrow incident. Dr. Olsen's recovery progressed slowly but steadily through the winter months, with her medical team reporting significant improvements in mobility and strength as her injuries healed and she adapted to the physical limitations caused by the attack. Her determination to return to Arctic research work provided motivation during the difficult rehabilitation process, though medical officials indicated that any return to fieldwork would require extensive safety modifications and support systems. The bear attack at the Barrow Arctic Research Station became a watershed moment in Arctic research operations, leading to fundamental changes in how research facilities approach wildlife management and emergency preparedness in polar regions. The incident served as a stark reminder that despite advances in technology and safety procedures, humans working in Arctic environments remain vulnerable to the raw power of nature's most formidable predators. The research team's heroic response to the emergency, particularly Tom Sullivan's decisive action in neutralizing the bear threat and Dr. Kowalski's expert emergency medical treatment, became a model for emergency response training at remote research facilities worldwide. Their actions under extreme pressure demonstrated the importance of comprehensive training and proper equipment for personnel working in dangerous environments. Dr. Olsen's survival and eventual recovery represented a triumph of human resilience, medical expertise, and the dedication of colleagues who risked their own lives to save her during the attack. Her experience became an inspiration to researchers worldwide and a powerful reminder of the personal costs associated with advancing scientific understanding in Earth's most challenging environments. The incident's long-term implications extended to wildlife management policies throughout the Arctic region, as officials worked to develop strategies for managing increasing human-wildlife conflicts in areas where climate change was disrupting traditional patterns of animal behavior and habitat use. The detailed documentation of Bear 47's behavior provided valuable insights for developing predictive models and prevention strategies. As the months passed following the December 22, 2024 attack, the Barrow Arctic Research Station gradually returned to normal operations, though the memories of that terrifying night would remain with every person who experienced it for the rest of their lives. The facility's continued operation served as a testament to the importance of Arctic research and the dedication of scientists willing to work in dangerous conditions to advance human understanding of our changing planet. The polar bear storm that had brought Bear 47 to the research station ultimately claimed more than property damage and human suffering. It marked the end of an era of innocence in Arctic research operations and the beginning of a new chapter in which the growing desperation of Arctic wildlife would require constant vigilance and unprecedented safety measures to protect both human researchers and the magnificent predators they studied. Dr. Karen Olsen's story became a symbol of survival against overwhelming odds and a reminder that in the Arctic, the line between life and death remains razor-thin, determined by split-second decisions, heroic actions, and the thin barriers of technology and training that separate human civilization from the raw power of the natural world. The scars she carried would serve as permanent reminders of her encounter with one of Earth's most magnificent and dangerous predators. But they would also represent her victory over forces that sought to claim her life in the endless white wilderness of the Arctic.